Somewhere in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, in the winter of 1959, 9 people walked into the snow and never walked back out. They were experienced. They were prepared. They knew these mountains. And then, one by one, they were found dead across a frozen slope under circumstances that investigators at the time couldn't explain, and that researchers are still debating more than 60 years later. That's the thing about this story. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. It just sits there in the cold, quiet, and patient, with a question it refuses to answer. If you're listening to this right now to fall asleep, good. That's exactly why I make these. Drop a comment before you drift off. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely read them, and there's something I find endlessly comforting about the idea that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto and someone wrapped in blankets in Edinburgh are all hearing the same story at the same moment. You're not as alone in the dark as you think. Now, back to the snow. February 1959. A group of 9 hikers, mostly university students and young graduates, set out into the Ural Mountains on a route that was ambitious but not reckless. These were serious outdoor people, the kind who trained, who planned, who kept journals. They had done trips like this before. The mountains were cold, yes. The terrain was demanding, yes. But nothing about their preparation suggested they were walking into anything other than a hard, rewarding winter expedition. They never reached their destination, and when searchers finally found their camp, high on a slope called Kuntsevich, what they discovered raised more questions than it answered. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers' boots were still inside it. Their warm gear was still inside it. Whatever sent 9 experienced winter travellers out into temperatures well below freezing, in their socks, in the dark, it happened fast. Fast enough that they didn't stop to dress. Fast enough that cutting through the tent wall was somehow the better option than using the door. They were found scattered across the slope and down into a nearby tree line. Some had injuries that seemed inconsistent with the terrain. Broken ribs, a fractured skull. Damage to internal organs that a forensic expert at the time compared to the kind of force you'd see in a car crash. Not a fall, not a fight, not anything the investigators could easily account for. One victim was missing her tongue. A few of the bodies showed traces of radiation when tested weeks later. No clear cause was ever officially established. The Soviet investigation concluded that the deaths resulted from, quote, an unknown compelling force, and then the files were sealed. That phrase has rattled around in people's heads ever since. An unknown compelling force. It's not an answer. It's the shape of an answer with nothing inside it. The event takes its name from the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, the Dyatlov Pass incident. It's been picked over by journalists, documentary filmmakers, scientists, hikers, historians, and conspiracy theorists for decades. People have proposed avalanches, military testing, infrasound from the wind, panic attacks, a confrontation with strangers, and things considerably more difficult to explain. What makes it persistent? What keeps it alive in the imagination long after so many other cold case mysteries have faded, is the combination of specific, documentable strangeness and the near-total absence of a satisfying explanation. Almost everything about that night is slightly wrong. Not dramatically, theatrically wrong in the way of a horror story, but quietly, stubbornly wrong in the way that real unsolved things tend to be. So that's where we're going tonight. Slowly, without rushing to conclusions that the evidence doesn't support. We'll follow those 9 people from the city to the mountains, through the days of the expedition, to the last photographs they ever took. We'll walk the slope with the searchers who found them, we'll sit with the investigators and their limits, and at the end we'll look honestly at what the evidence actually allows us to say and what it doesn't. The snow is quiet up there on Kuntsevich. It always has been. Let's find out what happened. To understand what happened on that slope, you have to understand who these 9 people were. Not just as victims of a mystery, but as people with histories and habits and reasons for being there in the first place. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, an engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg. He was the kind of person who builds things, who solves problems methodically, who plans. He had led expeditions before, shorter ones, harder ones, routes that had tested him and come out the other side as experience rather than disaster. The others trusted him. That trust wasn't arbitrary, it was earned. The rest of the group were cut from similar cloth, mostly students and recent graduates in their early 20s. Zina Kolmogorova was known for being warm and socially anchored, the kind of presence that holds a group together over long, cold days. Rustem Slobodin was athletic, careful. Yury Doroshenko and Yury Krivonishenko had both been on previous expeditions. Lyudmila Dubinina was 20 years old and already had a reputation as one of the more physically capable members of her hiking club. Alexander Zolotaryov was the outlier, older than the rest, 37, a hiking instructor from outside the university circle, joining the group somewhat late. His presence has attracted more speculation than almost anything else about the trip, partly because he's harder to place, and partly because the records around him are thinner. And that matters, because the records around all of them are thinner than we'd like. What we have are diaries kept by several group members during the expedition, photographs developed from cameras found at the camp, official documents from the Soviet investigation, and the recollections of family members, friends, and fellow hikers collected years and sometimes decades later. Each of these sources has limits. The diaries end before the last night. The photographs are incomplete, some frames never fully explained. The investigation was constrained by the political realities of the time, and the later testimonies carry the particular distortions that memory applies to things people are still trying to make sense of. Translations from Russian add another layer of approximation. Small things shift. All details that seemed clear in one account become uncertain in another. This is where the uncertainty begins, not with the deaths themselves, but earlier, in the paper record that surrounds ordinary people living ordinary lives before something went wrong. Because that's the other thing to understand about these hikers. In post-war Soviet society, organised outdoor sport wasn't a hobby. It was a culture, a serious and prestigious one. Young people joined hiking clubs, trained systematically, accumulated experience on progressively harder routes. There were official difficulty categories. Reaching the highest grades was a mark of real accomplishment, the kind that carried weight among your peers. A third category winter route, which is what this trip was classified as, that wasn't casual. That was something you had to earn the right to attempt. These 9 people had earned it. They went into those mountains not despite knowing what they were doing, but because they did. The route itself was ambitious, but it wasn't reckless. Igor Dyatlov had filed the itinerary with the hiking club at the Ural Polytechnic Institute before the group departed. Someone would know where they were going, more or less. Someone would notice if they didn't come back when expected. The plan was to travel roughly 350 kilometers on skis through the northern Urals, a region that sits in the far northeast of what is now Russia, where the Ural Mountains serve as the geological seam between Europe and Asia. In winter, this is some of the most remote terrain on the continent. Not remote in the way that a national park is remote, where remote means 2 hours from the nearest gas station. Remote in the way that means days from the nearest settlement, in temperatures that can drop below -30 Celsius, in conditions where a single wrong turn doesn't lead you somewhere inconvenient. It leads you somewhere fatal. The group left Sverdlovsk by train on January 23, 1959, heading north toward a small settlement called Ivdel. From Ivdel they continued by truck, and then by a horse-drawn vehicle to a logging settlement known as Second Northern, an outpost so modest it barely registered on most maps. This was where the last reliable infrastructure ended. Everything beyond it was wilderness and weather. From Second Northern they would travel on foot and skis. The intended route curved northwest, skirting the edge of the Ural Ridge, climbing toward the high passes. Their destination, the goal that gave the route its shape, was a peak called Ototen. The name, in the local Mansi language, carries a meaning that has been rendered in various translations, but one version often repeated is something close to "don't go there." Whether the hikers knew this is unclear. Whether it would have changed anything is another question entirely. Ototen sits at around 1,182 meters above sea level. Not a dramatic elevation by global standards, but the northern Urals aren't the Alps or the Himalayas. What they lack in raw height, they compensate for in exposure. The ridgelines here are treeless and flat-topped, swept by winds that have nothing to stop them for hundreds of miles. A storm on the upper slopes isn't just uncomfortable, it's a whiteout, zero visibility, wind-chill temperatures that can kill exposed skin in minutes. To reach Ototen and return, the group needed to cross a high pass in the area of a mountain the Russians called Kolatsyakl. The Mansi name for this peak has been translated somewhat dramatically as Dead Mountain. Again, the hikers may or may not have known this. What they did know is that it was a waypoint, one of several landmarks that organised the route in their minds. Their supplies were organised with the care you'd expect from people who'd done this before. Communal food rations calculated for the duration, shared cooking equipment, a tent large enough for the group, a canvas model that could be extended and pitched low to the ground for wind protection, skis and poles, sleeping bags, ice axes, a stove, a small library of personal items recorded in their diaries, the kind of ordinary objects, spare socks, playing cards, a mandolin carried by one of the group members that make the whole thing feel more real and somehow more heartbreaking. The timeline they'd filed anticipated returning to Vijay, a small settlement south of 2nd Northern, by around February 12th. On that date, or shortly after, someone back in Sverdlovsk would receive a telegram confirming the group was out and safe. That telegram was always the mechanism. As long as it arrived, everyone could stop holding their breath. 2 early decisions are worth noting, because they become significant later in almost every account of what happened. The first was the composition of the group itself. A 10th member, a hiker named Yury, had travelled with them from Sverdlovsk and made it as far as 2nd Northern before turning back. He was ill, his joints giving him trouble, and he made the rational decision to withdraw before the serious terrain began. His departure reduced the group to 9. He was also the last person to see them alive. When his testimony was eventually collected, he became something of an involuntary chronicler, the one who had to describe what everyone looked like when they were still whole, still joking, still loading their packs with the ordinary confidence of people who expected to come home. The second decision was about timing and route adjustment. The weather in January had been harsh even by the standards of the Northern Urals. There are suggestions in the diaries that the group fell behind their intended pace in the first few days, struggling through deep snow, covering less ground than planned. This meant that when they reached the slopes of Kholat Shakhl on the evening of February 1st and chose to push on rather than descend to the tree line to camp, they were already operating on a slightly compressed schedule. Why they made that choice, to stay high on the exposed slope rather than drop into the shelter of the forest below, has been debated for decades. Some think visibility was worse than they realised. Some think they simply misjudged how quickly conditions would change. Some think there was a reason to stay high that we haven't been able to account for. That choice, one line on an itinerary, one judgment call on a frozen slope, became the fulcrum on which everything that followed would turn. By the time they pitched their tent on the eastern flank of the mountain that night, they were still alive and still, as far as we can tell, in good spirits. The last diary entries are unremarkable. Someone made a small joke. Someone noted the weather. 9 people went to sleep in the kind of cold that makes the darkness feel solid. What happened after that is the question that has refused, for 65 years and counting, to resolve itself into anything comfortable. To understand what may have happened on that slope, you have to understand the stage it played out on. Not the map lines and elevation profiles, but the thing itself. Late winter in the Northern Urals. On paper, you can write -20, -30 Celsius. You can look up historical averages, see numbers laid out in tidy columns, but numbers don't tell you what that feels like on your face, on your lungs, in your hands after you take your mittens off for 30 seconds to tie a frozen strap. In late January and early February, this part of the world is emerging very slowly from the deepest part of winter. Daylight is returning, but grudgingly. At those latitudes you might get 8, maybe 9 hours from first light to full dark. The sun never climbs very high. Even at noon it hangs low, bleeding a kind of sideways light across the snow. The result is a world that is technically day, but feels like a long, pale twilight. Below the tree line in the forested valleys, the air is still, muffled by snow-laden branches. Temperatures there can sit around -15 or -20, sometimes lower. It is dangerous, but it is at least familiar danger. Fires burn more easily among trees. There is wood to burn, hollows to shelter in, terrain that gives you some sense of orientation. Higher up, on the bare ridges and slopes, the numbers change meaning. -15 in a valley is not the same as -15 on an exposed plateau with wind. The wind in the Northern Urals has very little to interrupt it. It slides in from the Arctic, gathers speed across the open tundra, and breaks itself on those flat-backed mountains. Sustained winds of 10, 15 meters per second are not unusual on ridgelines. Gusts can be stronger. At those speeds, the airstrips heat away from any exposed surface at an astonishing rate. A still air temperature of -15 can become a wind chill equivalent of -30 or worse. Skin left uncovered can begin to freeze in minutes. Metal sticks to fingers. Moisture in your breath crystallizes on scarves, on hoods, on the ends of your hair. The snow in these conditions behaves in ways that are both predictable and treacherous. In the forest, low winds and sheltering trees allow a deep, soft blanket to build up. Powder, beautiful to ski through, exhausting to wade in when you're breaking trail. Higher on the slopes, the wind scours the snow, lifting loose crystals into the air, packing them into hard drifts. In some places it strips the ground nearly bare. In others it dumps the snow into depressions and gullies, creating deep pockets that look solid on the surface but collapse under weight. This constant movement of snow creates slabs, layers of wind-compacted snow sitting on top of weaker, less cohesive layers. To a trained eye, under good conditions, you can sometimes read these structures, subtle differences in texture, in colour, in how the snow sounds under your skis. But add blowing snow and flat light, and the mountain becomes a blank page. On a calm, clear day, skiing in these mountains is demanding but manageable. You can see distant landmarks, ridges stand out, snowfields glitter with shadows and highlights. Judging distance, slope and direction is still work, but it is possible. When the weather turns, something else happens. The clouds descend. Wind throws loose snow into the air, and the boundary between ground and sky starts to disappear. The whiteout that results is not just low visibility, in the way we talk about fog on a highway. It is the removal of almost every visual cue your brain relies on to understand space. In a full whiteout, you can look down at your skis and not see them. You can stretch out a hand and watch it fade into a grey nothing. The horizon vanishes, shadows vanish. Even the usual signs of slope, how pressure feels under your feet, how your body leans, can become unreliable when gusts push you one way and then another. Navigation in these conditions becomes an act of faith in your instruments and your prior planning. Compass bearings, route notes, memories of the map. Experienced winter hikers tie themselves to these abstractions. They choose a bearing and follow it, counting paces or time, trying to picture where that invisible line runs across a landscape they can no longer see. But even the most skilled navigators are still human. In high wind and blowing snow, maintaining a straight line is hard. You tend to drift. You unconsciously compensate for the slope. You avoid the feeling of the wind in one ear and end up gradually curving off your intended track. Over an hour, 2 hours, a small degree of drift becomes a significant deviation. Meanwhile, exposure is making all of this harder. Cold doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it changes how your brain works. When your body is exposed to intense cold, it prioritizes keeping your core warm. Blood vessels in your fingers, toes, ears, and nose constrict. Fine motor control goes first. Tasks that require dexterity become clumsy. Zippers snag. Knots refuse to come undone. You drop things. You fumble a match and it dies in the snow. As exposure continues, and as your body burns through its available energy, shivering sets in. Shivering is a survival mechanism, a way of generating heat through involuntary muscle activity. But it is also a signal that your reserves are being tested. Shivering muscles use a lot of oxygen and glucose. If you're already tired, already calorie deprived from days of heavy exertion, the cost mounts quickly. Cognitive functions are tightly linked to temperature and energy availability. Hypothermia is not just a physical condition, it is a mental one. Mild hypothermia can cause confusion, slowed reaction times, difficulty in making decisions. As it deepens, people lose the ability to think clearly about their own safety. They may become apathetic or paradoxically irrationally active, starting projects they can't complete. They may misjudge distances, misread risks, forget steps in basic procedures they've known for years. In the context of a storm on an open slope, this means that the very moment when you most need sharp judgment is also the moment when your brain is least capable of providing it. Experienced hikers know this, at least in broad strokes. That is why campsite selection in winter is treated almost as a discipline in itself. Under normal circumstances, a group like Dyatlov's would aim to camp below the tree line when possible. Forest offers shelter from wind. Trees break up air currents, reduce drift, and catch some of the airborne snow. Among trees you can dig into the snowpack to create wind walls. You can suspend a stovepipe, string lines, dry gear. The temperature may not be dramatically higher, but the perceived warmth, the absence of constant wind, makes an enormous difference. When a forested campsite isn't available, winter hikers look for terrain features that mimic some of those benefits. Shallow depressions where the wind is less fierce, leeward sides of small rises, places where a snow wall or trench can be constructed quickly. The goal is not comfort in any luxurious sense. It is to minimize exposure to wind and drifting snow, to create one small pocket of relative stability in a moving landscape. Slope angle matters too. Camping directly on steep slopes is usually avoided if it can be helped, for reasons that include avalanche risk and the practical difficulty of keeping a tent anchored and level. If you do have to camp on a slope, a common technique is to dig into it, cutting a platform, building a wall, trying to tame the gradient into something more livable. All of this takes time and energy. At the end of a long day, in failing light, with wind rising, there's always a trade-off to be made between the ideal site and the site you can actually reach, prepare, and occupy before darkness and exhaustion close in. Do you spend another hour descending to the tree line, knowing that every minute makes pitching camp colder and more difficult? Or do you accept an exposed site, telling yourself it's only for one night, that you can push on in the morning? These decisions are usually mundane. Thousands of groups make them every year in cold mountains all over the world, and nothing remarkable happens. The tent holds, the stove lights, people grumble about the wind, boil water, trade jokes, and go to sleep. But the margin for error is thin. A minor navigation slip in a whiteout, a slightly more exposed slope than intended, a wind that strengthens overnight rather than easing, a snowpack that behaves just a little differently than expected, a temperature that drops a few degrees lower than the forecast. Under normal conditions, each of these would be a footnote, a story told later with a shrug. In the combined environment of late winter Urals, short days, hard wind, shifting snow, and a group slightly behind schedule, these small things can begin to interact. An ordinary environment becomes a system of hazards, and that system can, under the wrong alignment of variables, produce outcomes that feel anything but ordinary. When people look at what happened on Kuntsevich and say it couldn't just have been the weather, what they often mean is that they can't imagine the weather doing something so extreme, so final. But the reality of winter travel is that the weather doesn't have to do anything supernatural. It only has to press slowly and steadily on tired humans making decisions at the edge of their endurance. On the last day, the Dyatlov group wrote in their diaries, they were not walking into a legend. They were walking into a very specific set of late winter conditions shaped by temperature, wind, snow, and light. The next traces we have of them come from what they left behind on that slope, their camp, their tracks, and the silent record of where and how they tried to fight back against the cold. For what happens next, we lose the continuity of living memory and step into a different kind of record. Ink on paper, pencil on damp pages, like caught on film and frozen in silver grains. The last normal day of the Dyatlov group survives not as a continuous story, but as scattered moments their hands happen to record. Most of what we know about that day comes from journals. Each hiker kept some form of diary, some more detailed than others. They wrote in shared notebooks, in personal ones on loose sheets. Some entries are practical, weather notes, distances covered, repairs made. Others are jokes, small sketches, private thoughts. When you read them, you feel how ordinary this all was to them. For them, this was not the prelude to anything. It was just the next day of a long ski trek. The tone of those final entries is normal, not ominous, not ecstatic, tired, a little irritable, often playful. Someone complains about the cold in a theatrical way, Someone makes fun of another's snoring. They tease one of the men about his cooking, write mock orders and decrees, as though the tent were a tiny republic with its own bureaucracy. There is a warmth in the way they complain. You can feel the camaraderie that comes from shared hardship. They write about being behind schedule, but it's not panic. It's more like a note on a to-do list. The weather had already delayed them before. Losing a day was an inconvenience, not a disaster. They adjust their plan, talk about catching up. Experienced hikers are used to the idea that a route on paper is not a contract with the mountain. It's a wish, subject to revision. In their last full diary entries, they mention the wind strengthening, visibility dropping. They talk about the forest thinning, the slope opening. The names we use now, their pass, the Mountain of Dead, are largely applied after the fact. In their own words, they are simply moving from river to ridge, from forest to open ground, following a route they have laid out in advance. The cameras tell us other things. Several were found in the tent and in the snow around the campsite. The film, painstakingly developed later, preserves a series of still moments from those final days. Hikers half buried in snow drifts laughing, someone adjusting a pack, someone standing beside a makeshift stove, face blurred by motion as they turn. The mood in those photographs is consistent with the diaries. Focused, but not grim. They are working, saws in hand, cutting branches, digging platforms in the snow. But between tasks they pause to pose, to wave, to pull a face for the lens. You do not sense a group on the verge of collapse. You sense a group in the middle of a demanding but familiar expedition. One of the last sequences on film shows them higher on the slope, heading into more exposed terrain. You see them leaning into the wind, jackets tightened, hoods up. The horizon is hazy, the sky low. Snow is blowing across the frame, blurring edges. Faces are less clear now, swallowed by balaclavas and piled hats, but the body language remains purposeful. Skis angled, poles planted, a line of figures moving uphill. Look closely at their gear and it tells another story. Boots laced properly, bindings fastened. Layered clothing, as any winter group would use. Inner shirts, sweaters, padded jackets, outer shells. Their gloves are mismatched but adequate. Scarves, caps, helmets with ear flaps. This is not a group improvising in the cold with insufficient kit. They have planned. They have packed for conditions like this. The placement of that gear in the final photographs and in the tent later recovered is one of those small details that becomes strangely significant. You see the canvas tent pitched across a cut into the slope. Inside, their belongings are arranged in an order that only makes sense if you have lived in such a space. Boots here, packs there, stove components in a corner, not yet assembled, but grouped. Some sleeping bags are already unrolled, others still folded. Food is laid out, some half prepared, a loaf of bread sliced, slices of sausage, a knife set aside. This suggests routine, the pattern of arriving, unpacking, claiming a corner, starting the evening's tasks. It does not look like a camp thrown up in blind haste. It looks like a camp built at the end of a tiring day, according to habits they have repeated dozens of times. Trail choices, too, show up in their notes like small, almost casual decisions. In one diary, there is a mention of turning off the planned route, perhaps to gain elevation earlier, perhaps because of the conditions underfoot. On a map, that shift is a line bending westward into more open ground. On the ground, in a whiteout, with snow driving across your vision, it is a choice made under pressure. Follow the bearing up and over or drop back to the trees and lose height you will have to regain tomorrow. Later investigators would stand on that same slope with those same maps, ask why they camped where they did, why they did not push back to the shelter of the forest. Those questions grow heavier because of what followed. But in the moment, for them, it was likely a simple calculation. Daylight fading, wind strong, group tired. Dig in here, it's good enough for one night. The records we have, lines in a journal about strong wind, a photograph of skiers leaning into it, the angle of a tent cut into a hillside, are all fragments. Each seems solid, factual. But the space between them is wide. You can line them up and build a timeline. Morning. Leave the previous camp in the forest, packs repacked, trail rejoined. Midday. Climbing, weather deteriorating, slope angle increasing. Afternoon. Decision point, forest edge behind them, ridge ahead. Late afternoon. Tent site chosen, snow cut away, canvas raised and guide out against the wind. Early evening. Food unpacked, boots loosened, some sleeping bags spread. The journals and photographs support this outline, but they do so loosely. No one writes, "At exactly 4:17 p.m. we chose this precise spot." No one notes, "Visibility fell to 20 meters." When you read their words, the times are approximate, the descriptions subjective. Cold, strong wind, bad visibility, heavy work. These are human impressions, not instrument readings. This is what it means to reconstruct a day from fragments rather than certainty. Historians, investigators, curious readers, we all tend to smooth these pieces into a continuous film in our minds. Yet in reality there are gaps, minutes, perhaps hours we can only guess at. Conversations that were never written down. Second thoughts, if there were any, that live only in the silence between sentences. Even on the film there is a last frame where somebody's gloved hand or a blur of snow in front of the lens marks the end of their recorded day. After that, nothing. The camera goes back into its case, or into a corner of the tent. Life continues beyond the viewfinder, unrecorded. The significance of small details grows larger because of this darkness that follows. A jacket laid out near the entrance rather than hung up. An ice axe planted in the snow outside instead of brought in. Skis arranged under the tent floor, stiffening it. Each of these details is routine for a winter camp, and yet, after the fact, each becomes a potential clue. Were they expecting to move at night? Were they comfortable enough to settle? Or simply following habit, not imagining anything would interrupt the usual sequence of cooking, talking, sleep? As the last entries were written, the last photographs taken, night was approaching on that slope. The flat grey light was draining out of the sky. Wind, already strong, likely sharpened in the hours after sunset. Temperatures fell as they always do. Inside the tent, the familiar rituals of evening were probably beginning. Dry socks, hot food, stories, the small negotiations over space and warmth that define winter expeditions. From that point on, our certainty ends. We know they built that camp. We know they did not walk away from it in the morning like they planned. Everything in between, the sounds they heard, the conversations they had, the exact moment when routine dissolved into emergency, is beyond the reach of their pencils and cameras. We are left standing at the edge of that last normal day, looking out into a night described only by their absence from it. The rest of the story has to be told from tracks in the snow, cuts in canvas, and the positions of bodies found weeks later. But the last written words and final photographs remain as a kind of quiet border. On one side, ordinary human effort and companionship. On the other, a darkness we can chart in fragments, but never fully light. In the days that followed, no one on the outside knew that anything had changed on that slope. The tent stood where they had dug it in, the wind swept over it, the snow fell and drifted. Somewhere in the white noise of that mountain, the ordinary sequence of evening, sleep, morning never completed. But hundreds of kilometers away, life went on according to calendars and clocks. Before they left, the group had filled out the usual paperwork. Under the rules of the time, serious hikes were registered with sports clubs and route commissions. Plans were written down, not in case of mystery, but in the ordinary expectation of bureaucracy. Starting point, end point, checkpoints, expected dates. If you imagine the scene, it's prosaic. A room in Sverdlovsk or at the university. A table, a map. Dyatlov and the others going over their route with officials who had seen dozens like it. On those forms, and in conversations with friends and family, an approximate return window was given. Something like this. They would reach their final point, the village of Vizhay and then Ivdel, by early February. After that, a telegram would be sent back to the Ural Polytechnic Institute to say, "Everything's fine, we're back." People who go into the mountains in winter know that dates on paper are flexible. Weather moves a storm a day earlier or a day later. A broken ski binding, a strained ankle, an extra rest day. Any of these can push a schedule. In the letters and last conversations before departure, Dyatlov is said to have told people not to worry if they were delayed by a few days. It was built into the expectation. This is a serious route in serious conditions. A little lateness is normal. So when early February came and went with no telegram, no alarm bells rang immediately. At the Institute there were exams, lectures, meetings. The head of the sports club knew the group, knew their competence, knew the realities of winter treks in the Urals. The mental calculation was simple. Heavy snow, known delays early in the route, difficult terrain ahead. Give them some margin. Several of the hikers had promised to write home upon their return as well. Parents, siblings, friends were expecting letters and postcards after the trip. The absence of mail did not shock anyone at first. Postal service was slow, trains were late, students were busy. A lack of immediate news was part of normal life. But as the days stacked up, a small unease began to form, the kind that doesn't yet have words but puts a weight in the stomach. At first it shows up as glances at the calendar, counting on fingers. They should be back by now, shouldn't they? Then come the quiet questions in hallways and dorm rooms. Have you heard from Dyatlov's group? No, not yet. They're probably fine. Maybe the roads are blocked. What we know of this shift from patience to concern comes mostly from later recollections and institutional records. The exact conversation where someone's voice first sharpened from late to too late is not preserved, but gradually the tolerance for silence ran out. One of the first people to voice real worry was likely Dyatlov's mentor and colleagues at the Institute's sports club. Another crucial voice belonged to a man outside the university, the father of one of the hikers, growing increasingly anxious as days passed with no word. Parents and instructors share a particular kind of vigilance. They know when delay feels ordinary, and when it begins to cross into another category. That feeling led to phone calls and visits to the Institute, requests for information. Questions pressed a little more insistently. When was the last time anyone heard from them? When exactly were they supposed to send a telegram? What if something has happened? In systems like that of the Soviet Union, there were procedures, but they could be slow to move unless someone pushed. That pushing began in mid-February, first at the level of the Institute Sports Club, then with city and regional authorities. The Route Commission, which had approved the trek, suddenly had to reconsider the paperwork not as a plan, but as a potential rescue map. The first response was cautious. Before helicopters or soldiers, there were students, fellow hikers, friends of the missing. Experienced mountaineers from the Institute and local sports societies volunteered to go and look. Their thinking was practical. If the group is just delayed, perhaps nursing an injury or repairing gear in a village, there'll be embarrassment, not tragedy. If they're stuck or in trouble, every day matters. These initial search parties were small, improvised. They travelled by train and truck as far as they could, then on skis, following the planned route in reverse. They carried food, tents, and the hope that they would be welcomed at a campfire with laughter and complaints about the fuss everyone was making. The mood, at least outwardly, was still that of a recovery, not a disaster. Go out, find them, help them limp back if necessary. But even at this early stage, the calendar had already become an enemy. In the northern Urals in February, each day of delay is something concrete. More snow, more wind, more chances for tracks to vanish. If the group had been forced to camp somewhere unusual, if they had left signs of distress in the form of extra markers or signal fires, storm after storm could erase them. Weather at that time was harsh even by local standards. Blizzards moved across the ridges. Temperatures plunged well below freezing hour after hour. For the missing hikers, if they were alive and immobilized, this would be a terrible combination. For the searchers, it meant that seeing anything beyond a few dozen meters could be impossible. A tent could be 10 minutes ski away and invisible behind a low crest or a veil of driven snow. As the volunteer searchers pushed toward the area around the Auspia River and the planned pass, they reported nothing. No fresh ski tracks, no abandoned camps in the forest, no signs of a large group having turned around or diverted to a settlement. The route felt empty, like a corridor someone had walked down and carefully erased their own footprints behind them. This absence itself was news. When it filtered back to the Institute and the regional authorities, the tone changed. A late group can usually be found along the obvious lines of retreat. A lower valley, a hunter's cabin, a nearby village. The fact that no such evidence appeared forced a new conclusion. Wherever the Dyatlov group was, they were not on the safer, more travelled paths. At this point, official structures began to engage more heavily. The local branch of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and eventually military units stationed in the region were drawn in. Helicopters were requested. Professional rescuers joined the student teams. Maps that had been used to plan a sports route were now spread out on desks in offices, annotated with possible search grids and landing zones. The atmosphere around the case shifted in stages. At first, late return, then slightly overdue, then a missing group requiring a search. With the involvement of helicopters and soldiers, another phrase starts to fit better, even if no one wanted to say it aloud yet. Possible disaster. There was another complication. The longer the silence continued, the more every day served a double role. For the missing hikers, if they were out there, time chipped away at survival odds. For the future investigation, each passing storm chipped away at the record the snow might have held. Tracks filled in, minor disturbances softened and rounded, objects buried under new layers. What might have been a clear sequence of prints and marks became, with every gust of wind and fall of snow, more like an abstract pattern. When search flights finally circled over the region where the group was supposed to have crossed, they looked down on an almost uniformly white world. Forests, open slopes, ridges dissolving into haze. From the air, the Ural landscape in winter is both vast and monotonous. A single tent, a line of tiny figures, even a cluster of debris would be small details in that wide, moving surface. On the ground, the student searchers and their professional counterparts felt a subtler shift. At the beginning, they had been looking for their friends. As the days wore on and the cold sank deeper into bones and equipment, the unspoken possibility that they might now be looking for bodies rather than living people started to grow heavier. The jokes around evening fires became fewer. The silences grew longer. This is the moment when the story of the Dyatlov group, in the minds of those around them, turned from a tale of strong, capable young people fighting through a tough route into something else. A space opened between they are delayed and something is wrong, and that space, once opened, didn't close again. The calendar continued its indifferent march. The wind continued to erase. Somewhere on a slope that had no special name yet, beneath deepening snow, the true sequence of events waited. The search was on its way toward it, but still moving through a world where worry had just turned into fear, and where no one yet knew what they were about to find. They found it from the air first. From above, the slope was just another pale angle in a landscape made of pale angles. But one of the helicopter crews, circling and recircling over a pass that, on maps carried a number instead of a name, saw a small unnatural geometry in the snow, a faint rectangle, a depression that did not look like wind, something man-made, half-submerged. They marked the spot, coordinates, bearings from recognizable ridges and tree lines. Then it was up to the people on skis to go and see what, exactly, lay under that patch of disturbed white. The searchers were tired when they reached it. They had been moving through deep snow, against the grade, in biting wind. When they crested the last rise, they saw the tent's remains not as a dramatic revelation, but as something oddly modest. A low shape, collapsed, one end partly buried, one corner protruding like a broken wing. What they came upon, on that mountainside, did not look like a campsite frozen in the middle of your use. It looked like an absence, a canvas shell not standing but sagging. A ski pole here, a broken support there, guys and lines slack, some half swallowed by drifts. Snow had done its quiet work, settling, waiting, softening edges, yet even through that certain detail stood out. The tent was pitched on an open slope, well above the upper edge of the forest. No nearby trees, no natural windbreak. The mountain lifted behind it, rising toward the low pass the hikers had been aiming to cross. Below, the land sloped away toward the dark band of the forest, far enough that in winter conditions it would mean a significant descent on skis or on foot. Experienced mountaineers who saw the sight, then later, agreed on one thing. This was not an ideal camping spot. Whenever possible, winter groups seek shelter in the trees, or at least near them. The forest offers wood, some protection from the wind, more forgiving snow. Pitching a tent on a bare, exposed slope in a storm is not a first choice. It is something you do because other choices have closed. Why they chose that place, that is a question that would echo through every retelling. But before speculation came description. The searchers approached, checked for signs of movement, called out names into the cold air. No answer, only wind and the faint hiss of blown snow against canvas. When they brushed snow away and began to examine the tent itself, a pattern began to emerge. The canvas was not simply collapsed by drift. It had been cut. Several long slits ran from inside toward outside, as if someone had slashed their way through with a knife in haste. The official investigation would later note that at least one of those cuts appeared to have been made from the interior. Parts of the tent fabric were still caught under snow, others fluttered slightly, stiff with frost. The supporting ski poles and a pair of skis that had been used as a ridge beam were askew, not carefully dismantled. The tent had not been taken down in the orderly way experienced hikers would normally strike camp, even under pressure. It looked interrupted. Inside, however, there was not the chaos you might expect after a violent intrusion. What searchers found when they lifted the canvas, cleared more snow, and peered into the dimness was the beginning of the Dyatlov mystery as it is usually told. Almost everything was still there. Sleeping bags laid out, some partially unrolled, as if people had been resting or in the process of settling in for the night. Backpacks, cooking equipment, a small stove, the type used inside the tent, disassembled and not yet fired up. Food supplies, bread, tins, slabs of meat, bags of cereal, stacked or stowed in ways that suggested they had not yet been eaten. A log of expenses, a camera, notebooks with neat handwriting, a map. There were boots, many boots, heavy felt boots and ski boots, left in a heap near the entrance, just where people would take them off to lie down inside. There were warm outer jackets and padded trousers, not hanging or packed away as if no longer needed, but lying around the sleeping area. Personal items, socks, gloves, hats. For a winter camping group on a difficult route, to abandon this much insulation would be, under normal circumstances, like stepping out of a lifeboat into an icy sea. What was missing, compared to the full inventory of the group, were the people themselves, and some of the gear you would expect them to take if they had calmly decided to leave camp. More complete sets of clothing, boots for every person, axes, the stove ready to use, portions of food. Investigators moved carefully through the tent, recording what they could. In the days afterward, lists would be compiled. Whose jacket was where, which sleeping bag showed signs of being used, which did not, how many pairs of boots seemed to be missing, how many remained. They would note that some clothing appeared to have been moved or rearranged by later searchers, a detail that would complicate later attempts to reconstruct exact sequences. From the pattern of objects left behind, several early interpretations took shape. 1. Whatever happened, it came suddenly. People do not voluntarily walk away from warm footwear and winter clothing in a high mountain environment unless they feel they have no time, or unless something outside the tent seems more immediately threatening than the cold. 2. The slits in the fabric suggested that the normal exit, unzipping or unlacing the tent door, was not used, or not used by everyone. A cut through the wall of a tent is an extreme measure. It can be faster than crawling to the entry, but it also destroys your shelter. Doing that implies urgency, panic, or a belief that the tent itself has become unsafe. 3. The interior order contradicted the idea of a long struggle inside. There was snow inside, but that could have drifted in afterward through the cuts and open entrance. Pots were not overturned as if batted aside in a fight. Personal items were not strewn randomly. It looked, at a glance, like a camp that had been left mid-routine, not one ransacked. From these observations, early theories multiplied. Some investigators, particularly in later years, would suggest that a natural event, an avalanche, or the fear of one, drove the hikers suddenly out of the tent. Others would propose internal conflict, an argument that escalated catastrophically. A few would reach for more exotic ideas, but the tent itself, stubbornly, did not give a definitive answer. The cuts could mean desperate flight, or a calculated attempt to escape a sagging roof pinned by heavy snow. The abandoned boots could signal blind panic, or a flawed judgment made under pressure, run to a safer spot, regroup, return for gear. The location of the camp could be a mistake, or a compromise forced by worsening weather and fading light. There are also things the tent could not tell us. It could not, for example, fix an exact time. The last entries in diaries and route documents suggested the day and general sequence, reaching the slope, pitching camp, making plans for the pass tomorrow, but the moment at which rest turned into alarm is not recorded, nor could the tent alone indicate the emotional state of its occupants. Cuts and abandoned gear read as panic to some, as disciplined emergency procedure to others. Certain physical traces around the tent complicated interpretation in both directions. There were footprints leading away, not a chaotic spray in all directions, but a more or less coherent trail descending toward the tree line. Many of those prints, according to reports, appeared to have been made by people in socks or bare feet, with only some showing the deeper impressions of boots. This fact, connected with the gear left behind, reinforced the sense of abrupt departure. Yet the relative orderliness of the footprints, no signs of people crawling or staggering near the tent, suggested that at least at the moment of leaving, they were still moving with some coordination. The canvas, the poles, the scattered equipment, these became the first physical puzzle pieces. For the searchers on the slope, though, the most immediate reaction was simpler. They had found the camp. It was empty. In winter, at that altitude, on that slope, an empty tent with boots and jackets inside is almost never followed by a happy ending. On the mountain, as the wind continued to work at the torn edges of fabric, another realization began to settle over the search party. The tent posed its own questions, but it also pointed silently down the hill. Wherever the hikers had gone when they cut their way out, they had not taken the things that usually keep people alive in such conditions. So a new phase of the search began, from shelter to absence, from canvas to snow. The trail of light, half-erased footprints led away from the ruined tent into the open white and toward the dark fringe of the woods below. And with that first line of tracks, another question crystallized, one that would haunt every analysis that followed. What makes a group of skilled, experienced winter hikers abandon their only real refuge on an exposed mountainside, step out into a February night with inadequate clothing, and walk, not run, down into the dark? The searchers began, as they had with the tent, by looking down. In snow, what is left by the living lingers in negative. Compressed crystals, shallow troughs, edges softened by drift. Around the collapsed canvas they could see disturbances where people had walked and worked while the camp was still in use. Those impressions were confused, layered, the product of repeated steps. But beyond that immediate halo, one pattern stood out. A line, then several lines. Parallel enough, close enough, that investigators would later treat them as a single group movement. Tracks leading away from the tent's opening and, significantly, away from the cuts in its side. Not radiating outward in all directions, not scattered, heading with some consistency down slope toward the distant trees. Descriptions from the time and later reconstructions agree on this much. There were discernible human footprints leading from the tent area toward the forest below, stretching for several hundred meters before wind and fresh snow blurred them beyond recovery. In places, they appeared almost ordinary, the kind of shallow heel-to-toe impressions you might see on a packed winter trail after a group has set off for the day. Except these were not set in daylight on prepared ground by people with boots laced. Several witnesses remarked that many of the tracks had the elongated, rounded shape of bare or socked feet. Toes not always clearly defined, but an outline too soft and wide to be a heavy boot. Others showed the deeper, more blocky impact of footwear, a mixture. Some of the party apparently had time to get boots on, some did not. That contrast would become one of the enduring images of the case. A caravan of people walking into sub-zero wind, some with felt soles, others with almost nothing between their skin and the snow. But snow is not paper. It does not record with perfect fidelity. It changes even as you look at it. By the time the search teams arrived, days had passed since the hikers left the tent. In that interval, wind had blown across the slope. New flakes had fallen. Crystals had sublimated in the dry air. Any footprints preserved at all were, in a sense, survivors, the most sheltered, the most recent, or the deepest. This makes certainty hard. When investigators later tried to count exactly how many individuals had made the tracks, the numbers did not always match. Some reports say 8 or 9 distinct trails, others fewer. Partly this is because, in unconsolidated snow, one person's step can obliterate another's or merge with it. Partly it is because drifting in fill blurs the edges until separate prints appear as one broader corridor. Even the apparent shape of a footprint can change. A bare foot that stamps into soft powder might initially leave a clear imprint of arch and toes. Hours later, crystals from the sides slump inward, filling the depressions and rounding the outline. A boot print, especially if made in a hurry, can lose its sharp corners. What looks, after several days of weathering, like a light, even pace might have been, at the time, a more laboured effort. Still, something about the spacing of the preserved tracks impressed those who saw them. They did not speak of frantic scrambling. Witnesses noted that the distance between steps, what investigators call stride length, seemed consistent, roughly what you would expect from people walking at a normal pace, not sprinting. There were no obvious signs near the tent of people having crawled away, no deep plough marks from someone dragging an injured leg. The first tens of meters at least looked like the progress of individuals in control of their movements. From this, early observers drew a quiet, unsettling inference. Whatever alarm had driven the group out of the tent by the time they were moving downhill, they were doing so in some kind of order. Not in a stampede, but in a line or loose column. That impression of discipline, of an organised retreat rather than blind flight, sits oddly alongside the image of cuts through canvas and boots abandoned on the floor. Yet even here, interpretation must be careful. Stride length can remain regular even when people are terrified. Our bodies often revert to familiar gaits. Snow depth can enforce a certain pace, simply because moving any faster becomes physically impossible, and the tracks that remained were, almost certainly, not a complete record of every step taken by every person. Wind can erase hesitation, stumbles, changes of direction, more quickly than it erases the more deeply compacted forward-moving strides. There were also places, further down slope, where the line of tracks seemed to spread, as if the group had fanned out slightly. Whether that represented search behaviour, feeling for a safer route, or the beginning of people drifting apart in the darkness is hard to say. The contours of the ground, unseen under the snow, can also force walkers to diverge and then reconverge around hidden hollows and minor ridges. Even with these caveats, the overall direction was unambiguous, down, toward the tree line. In winter, on an exposed ridge, the forest is not just a band of darker colour on the horizon. It is a promise. Trees mean less wind. Between trunks, air slows. Snow piles differently, often leaving depressions and pockets where, with some digging, you can make a more sheltered camp, or at least escape the worst of the gusts. Branches mean fuel for fire. Even in severe cold, dry twigs and bark can sometimes be coaxed into burning if you have the skill and materials. The canopy, however thin, catches some of the falling snow. Human beings drawn from a tent on an open slope in a storm do not have many good options. Heading toward the forest is one of the few that makes immediate intuitive sense. The hikers knew this. They had skied through taiga for days. They had cut wood, lit fires, built shelters among trees. From their tent door in daylight they would have seen the dark edge of the forest below as a clear line across the white. At night, in poor visibility, that same forest might have been nothing more than a darker mass felt as much as seen, a direction more than a destination. But if they had to leave, if they believed the tent unsafe, the instinctive choice would be to aim for that relative refuge. So the searchers, reading the tracks, did what the hikers had done. They followed. Step by step they moved out from the collapsed tent, walking in the depressions left by others, the wind tugging at clothing, the slope easing under their feet as they descended. Around them, the openness of the pass gradually began to narrow. The sky, still huge, was now bordered below by the approaching fringe of wood. Bare branches fringing the white like ink strokes, trunks standing shoulder to shoulder against the wind. Along the way they noted variations in the footprints. Here, impressions that looked more like socks. There, the deeper bite of a boot heel. In some spots the line thinned, as if one or two individuals had moved slightly aside, then merged back. But there were no sudden deviations shooting off at right angles, no clear record of someone breaking away in panic and running alone into the dark. As they came closer to the trees, the tracks grew harder to read. Wind had eddied differently near the change in surface roughness. Snow had scoured in some places, gathered in others. The forest edge itself acted as both shield and trap, leaving some prints sharply preserved in lee pockets, while obliterating others with drifts slipping from branches. Here, on the margin between open slope and sheltering wood, the story written in the snow began to fragment. It's at this boundary that the narrative of the Dyatlov group moves from what is relatively clear, an empty tent, a line of footprints, to what becomes progressively more tragic and strange. The tree line the hikers had aimed for, the place that should have offered them their best chance of surviving the night, did not save them. For the searchers, though, arriving there was simply the next logical step. Follow the tracks, reach the trees, look for signs of a new camp, a fire, perhaps a hastily thrown together shelter. In their minds the forest still held the possibility, however slim, of finding the hikers alive, clustered together, cold but protected. What they actually found among the first ranks of trunks, beneath a large cedar that stood slightly apart from the rest, would end that hope. The line of footprints, which had begun as an ordered descent from canvas to snow, led not to safety, but to the first of the bodies. The cedar was hard to miss. Even in a forest where most trees share the same narrow pole-straight form, occasionally one grows differently. Broader, more spreading, with thicker limbs that fan out instead of simply reaching up. The searchers coming down from the pass that day noted such a tree near the forest edge. A mature Siberian cedar standing slightly apart from its neighbours, its branches forming a rough sheltering crown. Beneath it the snow was disturbed. Some of the searchers saw it at once. Depressions in the white where men had been. The suggestion of a flattened space, as if several bodies had lain or sat there together. Nearby, scattered in the crust, were traces that did not belong to an untouched winter hillside. Charred sticks, remnants of burned branches, fragments of clothing frozen into odd twisted shapes, and then, in the shallow hollow at the base of the trunk, they saw the first body. It lay on its back or side, depending on which description you read, lightly covered by snow. Early accounts agree that the man was almost naked, stripped down to underclothes, perhaps a shirt, perhaps less, no boots, no heavy outer garments. In temperatures far below freezing, in a setting where the others had left behind padded jackets and felt shoes in the tent. Here was a person exposed to the elements in the most vulnerable way. A second body was found not far off, similarly underdressed. Some reports placed the two of them a few meters apart, as if they had collapsed separately but in the same general space. Later identification would link these remains to two members of the Dyatlov group whose clothing would subsequently be found in part on others. At the time of discovery, though, the searchers simply saw two young men who had died in the cold, close to a tree where someone had tried to make a fire. The fire is one of the few clear, practical efforts we can still trace. There were blackened branches on the ground, pieces that had been partially consumed before being extinguished by cold or lack of fuel. Some said the remains suggested a small, weak blaze, enough to leave soot, not enough to keep a group alive through a harsh night. The branches used were reportedly from the cedar itself and from deadwood nearby, not from a carefully prepared stockpile, but from whatever could be reached and broken off quickly. Later autopsy reports would add an unsettling layer. The bodies under the cedar showed signs of minor burns on hands and feet, as if they had been extremely close to the flames. There were also reports of skin damage and abrasions on fingers and limbs. Investigators noted broken branches high up in the tree, several meters above the ground, as though someone had climbed into it, perhaps repeatedly, snapping off limbs for fuel or searching for something else. Some of those higher branches were described as stripped of bark. Skin beneath the fingernails of at least one of the men was said to contain traces of cedar bark and wood. To some later interpreters, this painted a vivid picture. In the dark and brutal cold, with little or no clothing, two people clawing their way into a tree to fetch wood, scraping and cutting themselves in the process, then returning to a feeble fire that could never hope to match the intensity of the surrounding night. From this scene, the searchers moved outward and upward, and found more. Not far from the cedar, in the direction of the tent but still within the trees, they discovered 3 additional bodies spaced along a rough line leading back toward the pass. These were not clustered around a fire. They appeared in many accounts as if they had fallen while attempting to return uphill. One was found closer to the cedar, another farther, a third nearer still to the open slope. Their postures were interpreted as those of people who had been crawling or staggering when they succumbed, though again snow and time complicate precise reconstructions. Unlike the almost naked men at the tree, these 3 were more warmly dressed, some in parts of other people's clothing, suggesting that, at some point after the initial flight from the tent, garments had been redistributed among the group. Put together, the cedar and the bodies around it seemed to tell a simple story. Forced from the tent, some members of the party reached the relative shelter of the forest, attempted to light a fire, and began to succumb to exposure. Others, perhaps realizing the tent contained vital supplies, tried to make their way back and collapsed along the way. But human stories, especially in extreme environments, rarely align perfectly with our first impressions. To understand why underdressed bodies beneath a tree do not necessarily imply straightforward irrationality, it helps to consider what cold does to the human mind and body. Hypothermia is not a single event but a gradual decline. As core temperature drops, shivering begins, coordination worsens, and judgment erodes. People become clumsy, then confused. Decision-making degrades before consciousness slips away. One of the most puzzling behaviors sometimes seen in severe hypothermia is so-called paradoxical undressing, individuals removing clothing in the final stages of exposure, despite being desperately cold. The proposed explanations are physiological and neurological, rather than mystical. Blood vessels in the skin, which had constricted to preserve core warmth, can suddenly dilate, producing an intense sensation of heat. In a state of confusion, people may react by stripping off layers. Others simply lose the ability to understand the consequences of their actions and begin to fumble with zippers and buttons. Dyatlov researchers have often invoked this phenomenon when discussing the nearly unclothed men at the cedar. Perhaps they suggest these individuals initially reached the forest more adequately dressed, worked at the fire, and then undressed in the final disoriented stage of hypothermia. It is a plausible mechanism, but it is not the only one. In the Dyatlov case, there is another more mundane factor: clothing transfer. The later discovery of better-equipped bodies wearing pieces that originally belonged to the men at the tree suggests that, at some point, the living may have removed garments from the dead or dying to increase their own chances. This is harsh, but it is not irrational. In extreme cold, survival sometimes demands decisions we would never face in ordinary life. The burns on hands and feet can be seen the same way. Frostbitten or numbed skin, extended too close to a weak flame in a desperate attempt to feel warmth, can be injured without the person pulling away in time. There is nothing symbolically strange about this. It is exactly what you might expect from people at the limits of endurance, yet not every detail fits comfortably within a neat narrative. Why were branches broken so high in the tree? Why do some reports emphasize extensive damage to the cedar, as though someone had not only climbed it for fuel, but perhaps also as a lookout trying to see the tent or to escape something on the ground? Were the men under the tree there from the beginning, or had they originally been higher up and fallen? And the three on the slope, did they leave the cedar together in a deliberate attempt to return to the tent and retrieve supplies, or did they become separated from others during a more chaotic movement between shelter and camp? The sequence is hard to reconstruct from bodies alone. From the moment the first reports were written, competing interpretations arose. One reading sees the scene as essentially logical. A group, having fled the tent in a hurry, heads for the trees. Once there, they split tasks. Some gather wood, some attempt to organize shelter, some consider returning for gear. Clothing is redistributed from those who succumb first to those still mobile. Fire is attempted, but proves insufficient. One by one, they are overtaken by the cold. Another emphasizes confusion. The cuts in the tent, the mixture of bare feet and boots in the tracks, the scattered positions of the bodies, these, in this view, suggest a situation already marked by disorientation before the forest was reached. The actions at the cedar, from frantic climbing to ineffective fire building, might then be symptoms not of clear strategy, but of minds already compromised by cold, fear, or some other factor. A third, more speculative approach treats the cedar as evidence of something unseen. Perhaps, proponents suggest, the climbers were trying to escape an external threat, an avalanche, an intruder, a strange atmospheric phenomenon. From the vantage of the tree they might have hoped to assess whether it was safe to return, only to be defeated instead by the environment itself. What is widely accepted among careful researchers is narrower and more modest. It is broadly agreed that two members of the group died first near the cedar, underdressed, with a small fire having been made close by. It is accepted that at least one and probably more people climbed the tree, breaking branches high above the ground. It is accepted that 3 additional bodies were found between this tree and the tent, in positions consistent with an attempt to move back uphill. The presence of shared and redistributed clothing is also not in serious dispute. More contested are the specific behaviours, whether paradoxical undressing played a role, how deliberate the return toward the tent was, whether the tree climbing was primarily for fuel, vantage, or some other purpose, and how long the group remained alive at the cedar before dispersing or dying. These uncertainties are not failures of investigation so much as consequences of the setting. Snow and time erase fine detail. Cold changes the appearance of injuries. Memories of those first grim days among the trees were filtered through shock and later retellings. Still, the image endures, a solitary cedar at the forest edge, a faint fire that could not defeat the night, and the first of 9 bodies that would turn a remote Ural slope into one of the most argued over sites in modern history. From here the search would move deeper into the snowfield between tree and tent, then beyond, uncovering the rest of the party and, with them, the injuries that would elevate the incident from tragic accident to enduring mystery. From the cedar, the line of discovery bent back toward the open slope. Once searchers had marked the tree and the 2 bodies beneath it, they lifted their eyes to the uphill distance, toward the place where the tent was known, or at least believed, to have stood. Between those 2 points lay a shallow, uneven field of snow, interrupted here and there by low rises and depressions, scattered bushes, the indistinct boundary where forest thinned into bare hillside. It was along this corridor that the next 3 bodies emerged. They were not found all at once. Some were located days apart as weather allowed, as different teams worked the slope. Reports vary on the exact distances, but the pattern is broadly consistent. One body closest to the cedar, another somewhere in the middle ground, a third much higher, nearer to the location of the torn tent. The first of these, lying not far from the tree line, has often been described as if he had simply sunk down during a struggle to move forward. Accounts speak of a posture suggesting crawling or stumbling collapse, arms out, head facing in the general direction of the camp. He wore more clothing than the men at the Cedar, some of it his own, some identifiable as not originally his. Layers were mismatched, different sizes, different fabrics, sometimes multiple socks on one foot and none on the other. Farther up the slope, the second body lay with similar orientation. Again, clothing was heavier than that of the Cedar victims. Here too, later examination linked garments to other members of the party. A jacket that had belonged to one of the underdressed men, a piece of knitwear first seen in photographs on another shoulder, a patchwork of ownership that suggested, without fully explaining, some phase of redistribution. The third body, closest to the tent site, was found higher up, on ground more exposed to the wind. He also faced generally toward the tent. Some accounts speak of him being better dressed still, with outer garments and footwear that might have made him one of the last capable of meaningful movement. Others note that even he lacked full winter protection by the standards of their abandoned camp. It is tempting to see these three as frozen frames from the same sequence. A group leaving the Cedar, turning uphill, trying to get back. One falls, then another, then the last nearly reaches the slope above the forest before succumbing. The gradient of clothing, from least to most, seems to support this. Those in motion, those still strong enough or warm enough to attempt the climb, carry more layers, including garments stripped from those already dead or beyond saving. But as with every part of this story, the snow does not speak in complete sentences. Positions can be influenced by many things besides a single, linear attempt to return. People in extreme cold do not always walk until they are at the exact brink of collapse, then drop neatly in order. They may turn back and forth. They may rest, lose consciousness, regain it briefly. Blowing snow can shift bodies slightly over time, create drifts that change how we perceive posture decades later. Searchers, in the process of uncovering and moving remains, may alter exact orientations without realizing that future generations will pass each angle of arm and leg for hidden meaning. Still, even with these caveats, the arrangement between cedar and tent hints at something structured rather than purely random. Exposure in sub-zero conditions shapes how people move and where they fall. As hypothermia deepens, muscle strength drops. Coordination, already compromised by slippery snow and wind, worsens. People begin to lean, to favour certain movements that conserve remaining warmth. They may hunch forward, clutching at the chest or abdomen where organs must be kept warm longest. When they can no longer sustain upright posture, they often do not simply tip over like statues. They crumple, catch themselves once or twice, end up in positions that look like crawling or reaching. Investigators, looking at the three on the slope, saw bodies lying almost along a line that could be traced back from the tent toward the cedar. Not perfectly straight, not measured with a ruler, but following the most direct practical corridor between shelter in the trees and supplies on the ridge. This invited a question that remains central to every reconstruction of the Dyatlov night. At what point did the group divide, and why? One picture imagines a single, continuous movement. The entire party flees the tent, descends toward the forest, reaches the cedar. There they make a fire, assess their situation, and try to organize a response. As cold works its slow damage, decisions are made. Two are too weak or too lightly dressed and remain by the tree. Others, somewhat better equipped, decide that they must go back for clothing, stoves, food, anything that can turn a losing battle into a survivable night. They set out together, then, one by one, drop away as their strength fails. This scenario fits well with the gradient of bodies and the layering of clothes. It also aligns with what we know of group behavior in emergencies. People often try to return to the last known cache of safety and equipment, even if conditions have changed and the path is now dangerous. Another model is more fragmented. In this version, the split happens earlier, perhaps even at the moment the tent is abandoned. Some members, more lightly dressed or more panicked, head directly downhill for the tree line, seeking shelter. Others, maybe those who snatched boots or jackets on their way out, move more slowly, hover near the tent, or attempt to stay high. The cedar fire becomes not a fully collective strategy, but one node in a scattered pattern of movement. As cold and exhaustion mount, individuals and small clusters shift between these zones. Tent area, slope, forest edge. A person might leave the cedar to look for friends who never arrived, then collapse on the way back without ever truly attempting to reach the tent. Another, having made it part way up, could turn around when the wind proves too brutal, only to falter in the middle ground. In such a chaotic flow, the final resting places might still line up roughly between tent and cedar, but the underlying decisions would be more complicated than a single rescue attempt. There is also the question of time. How long did the group survive after leaving the tent? Minutes? An hour? Several hours? The presence of a fire suggests at least some period of organised activity. Clothing transfer implies enough awareness to recognise who was beyond help and who might yet be saved by an extra layer. But cold does not wait politely while people make their choices. The difference between life and death in those temperatures can be measured in tens of minutes, not leisurely stretches. If the three between forest and tent were part of a deliberate return, it was undertaken under extreme time pressure, with bodies already losing coordination and minds already clouded. Under such conditions, what looks from the outside like a straightforward tactical move may have felt, from the inside, like walking through deep fog, one step planned, the next improvised, the one after that taken almost by reflex. Investigators in 1959 did not have the advantage of decades of subsequent literature on hypothermia behaviour, cold weather psychology, or high-altitude disasters. They relied on more basic tools, distances measured by ski tracks and boot prints, observations recorded at the scene, autopsy notes. From these they tried to assemble a tentative sequence. First, the tent is left in a hurry, with most warm clothing and equipment remaining inside. A track of multiple footprints leads downslope toward the trees, some in socks, some in bare feet, some in partial footwear. No clear sign of pursuit or struggle appears around the tent itself. Second, the group, or most of it, reaches the tree line near the cedar. A fire is built, branches are broken, at least one person climbs high into the tree. At some point 2 members die there, whether quickly or after a longer struggle against the cold. Third, others, now wearing extra clothing that once belonged to the dead, move away from the cedar in the direction of the tent. They do not all make it. 3 fall at different points along the route, their positions frozen at various stages of effort. This scaffolding, the tent, the footprints, the cedar fire, the 3 bodies on the slope, formed the backbone of the official early narrative. Details, of course, were uncertain. Exactly when the 2 under the cedar died, whether the 3 on the slope left together or separately, whether their goal was truly the tent or simply uphill, away from the wind, or toward something familiar. Subsequent researchers have revised and reinterpreted, but most agree on the broad outline. An initial descent, a temporary refuge in the trees, and at least one attempt by some members of the group to move back toward the camp. What remains ambiguous is motive. Was the return driven primarily by rational assessment, the recognition that survival depended on recovering gear? Was it an instinctive pull toward the known, even if it was dangerous? Or did some other factor, still obscure to us, force them into that corridor between forest and tent? Those 3 bodies do not answer that question. They only fix in space the last distance their owners were able to cover, the last direction they faced. Beyond them, deeper in the trees, searchers would later find the remaining 4 members of the party, in a ravine that added yet another layer of complexity to the story. Severe injuries, broken bones, and patterns of damage that would ultimately fuel the most unsettling speculations about what really happened on that frozen slope. The ravine was not found in winter. By the time searchers reached that part of the forest, the season had already shifted. Snow that had lain smooth and unforgiving in February was beginning to sink, soften, and fracture. What had once been a nearly continuous white surface now showed hints of the landscape beneath, depressions, hidden channels, the beginnings of meltwater streams probing downward. The last 4 hikers were not visible on the surface. They were discovered only after teams began to probe deeper, using poles and shovels to test likely hollows, somewhere downslope from the cedar, in a natural gully or stream bed where snow had accumulated in especially deep drifts. A searcher's tool struck something that was not snow, not ice, not wood. Accounts differ slightly on the exact measurements of that hollow, how many metres from the cedar, how far below the level of the surrounding ground, but the essential picture is clear. Over the weeks since the tragedy, wind and snowfall had filled the ravine, piling a thick, heavy blanket over everything. The four lay beneath this in a kind of accidental snow cave, close to one another, partially shielded by the walls of the gully and whatever branches or scraps of material they had at hand. Later descriptions often speak as if they had built a den. There is some evidence to support this. Traces of cut branches, pieces of clothing arranged in ways that suggest padding or insulation, signs that someone had tried to create a more sheltered space than the open forest floor. If true, it would mean that at least some members of the group retained enough strength and clarity to work systematically, to think beyond the next few minutes. But the ravine also carried the most disturbing evidence of the night. When the bodies were recovered and brought back for examination, investigators noted injuries that did not fit the pattern seen in the other 5. These were not simply the expected outcomes of hypothermia: frozen limbs, superficial scrapes, stiffened joints. They included broken ribs, fractured skulls, and damage that some early observers compared, in their own words, to the aftermath of a serious car accident. It was these injuries, more than almost anything else, that would later pour fuel on the legend. Under the snow, one of the hikers had massive chest trauma. Multiple ribs broken on both sides, damage to internal organs consistent with a powerful compressive force. Another had a severe skull fracture extending across much of the cranium. A third showed significant rib fractures as well. In several of these cases, the skin over the injured areas was not torn in ways one might associate with direct blows from weapons, or with impact against jagged rock at high speed. Instead, pathologists described something more like blunt, distributed force, intense pressure applied over a wider area. Decades later, enthusiasts would seize on this phrasing. How, they asked, could such devastating damage occur without obvious external wounds? What could possibly produce automobile accident-level trauma in the middle of a remote snow-covered forest, with no sign of avalanches sweeping whole slopes clean, no great boulders moved, no toppled trees? To understand how others have tried to answer that question, it helps to imagine what heavy snow really is. To the eye, a deep drift can look soft, almost weightless. To the body, to bones and organs compressed beneath it, snow is water in slow motion. A cubic metre of packed snow can weigh hundreds of kilograms. In a ravine, snow does not just fall gently and stay. It slumps, settles, flows inward from the sides, and, under certain conditions, can collapse suddenly in slabs or cornices that behave more like wet concrete than feathery powder. In mountain environments, people can be crushed by snow without ever travelling very far. A small cornice breaking over a narrow gully can drop a dense block onto someone sheltering below. A roof of melting compacted snow can fall in as a cavity enlarges underneath. The body inside might be driven against the rigid floor of ice or rock with enormous force, the weight of many layers pressing downward in an instant. When modern avalanche experts read the Dyatlov files, some see in the ravine injuries a pattern that is sadly familiar from other alpine accidents. Multiple rib fractures on one side or both, lung damage, severe head trauma when a victim is driven sideways or backward into buried obstacles. They point out that blunt force trauma from snow is often accompanied by relatively limited external laceration. The energy is transmitted through clothing, through layers of snow, through the soft tissues of the body, breaking what is rigid, bone and organ, while sometimes sparing the outer skin from dramatic tearing. Adding to this, there is the problem of time. The ravine bodies were recovered months after death. During that interval, freeze-thaw cycles affected both the snowpack and the remains. In such conditions, tissues change. Skin can stiffen, then crack along unusual lines. Fluids can move, freeze, and expand. Bones, already fractured, may shift as the supporting matrix of muscle and ligament loses integrity. What an examiner sees in the morgue in May is not an exact, unaltered snapshot of what existed in the ravine in February. Even descriptions of injuries, when written down, are filtered through the language and diagnostic framework of the time. Soviet forensic terminology of the late 1950s did not always map cleanly onto later categories. Some phrases that sound dramatic when translated, extraordinarily severe trauma, force comparable to a motor vehicle collision, may have been, in context, attempts to express relative severity rather than literal mechanism. They tell us that the damage was major and not easily survivable, but they do not by themselves rule out natural causes. This is not to say that all is clear and tidy. Not every injury in the ravine fits neatly into a single story. Some reports mention localized skull damage that could be consistent with falling against a rock edge. Others note patterns that suggest compression from above. There are also soft tissue losses, for example, missing eyes and parts of the face, that, in later retellings, have been framed as mysterious or sinister. Here, again, time and environment matter. When bodies remain in running meltwater or under patchy snow for weeks, exposed parts are available to scavengers. Small animals, birds, and even aquatic organisms will target soft tissues first: lips, eyes, fingertips. Water itself abrades and alters. To investigators at the time, these effects were recognizable as post-mortem. They did not, in their official conclusions, ascribe them to violence on the night of the tragedy. Modern reviewers tend to agree on some core points and diverge on others. There is broad consensus that several of the ravine victims suffered serious life-threatening blunt force injuries to the chest and head. There is also agreement that these injuries could not have been caused simply by falling a short distance while standing on relatively soft snow. Some significant additional force source is required. Where debate persists is in the details. Some researchers argue that the injuries are fully compatible with a partial snow collapse or small slab avalanche into the ravine, possibly triggered while the group was constructing or occupying their improvised shelter. In this view, a mass of dense settling snow drove some of them against the bottom or walls of the gully, causing fractures, while others, partially shielded or located differently, escaped with less severe damage but not with their lives. Others remain unconvinced, pointing to what they see as inconsistencies in the recorded locations of bodies relative to suspected impact points, or questioning whether the topography and snow conditions, as they reconstruct them, could have produced the forces described. From these doubts, more exotic explanations have grown. Secret weapons tests, encounters with hostile humans, even stranger ideas that move far beyond ordinary physics. When we look closely at the historical record, certain claims that often appear in popular summaries turn out to be less solid than they seem. The notion that one hiker's tongue was ripped out in a way that defies natural explanation, for instance, is not strongly supported by the original documents. The autopsy notes describe missing soft tissue in the mouth area, consistent with prolonged exposure and decomposition in a wet environment. Similarly, the idea that bodies emitted unusual levels of radiation traces back to a small number of garments showing mild contamination, likely linked to industrial sources prior to the trip, not to glowing victims in the snow. Other points hold up better. The rib and skull fractures are repeatedly documented. The medical examiners, while not invoking violence by other humans, also did not dismiss the severity of these injuries. They stated plainly that if the victims had somehow survived the initial night and been brought to medical care, these particular wounds by themselves would have been considered critical. So we are left with a layered picture. At the ravine, the last 4 hikers appear to have done what people in desperate cold often do when they still have any strength. They sought lower ground, deeper snow, more shelter from the wind. They seem to have made some effort, however minimal, to construct a more protected space. At some point, whether during that effort or afterward, one or more of them experienced catastrophic blunt force trauma, most plausibly from a sudden shift or collapse of the snow mass around and above them. The snow then did what snow always does. It settled. It preserved and altered at the same time. It hid the scene from human eyes until spring, when searchers digging in a thawing ravine brought back not just bodies, but a set of questions that would prove far harder to exhume. Those questions would flow into the next phase of the story, the official investigation, its methods and its limits, and the way its conclusions, tentative and constrained, left just enough space for rumours and legends to grow for decades afterward. The bodies came back one by one, first on sledges, then by truck and train, carried from the white silence of the past to the busy echoing corridors of Sverdlovsk. With each arrival, the story shifted from speculation on the snow to notes on paper, signatures, stamps, and the careful, constrained language of an official inquiry. In late February 1959, the regional prosecutor's office opened a criminal case. On paper, the wording signalled seriousness. Possible foul play, death under unclear circumstances. In practice, the early steps were straightforward and unsurprising. Identify the dead. Determine the cause of death. Look for signs of violence, for evidence of crime, for anything that would turn an Alpine tragedy into a criminal case. Investigators began with what they had: the tent on the slope, the scattered equipment, the diaries and film rolls left behind. They interviewed the rescuers who first reached the site. They questioned friends and fellow students in Sverdlovsk, the sports club officials who had approved the route, and the Mansi hunters who knew the region better than anyone. Alongside this, forensic doctors started their examinations. The first 5 bodies, those found between the tent and the cedar, were autopsied in early March. Reports described hypothermia as the primary cause of death. Minor injuries were noted: abrasions, small cuts, bruises consistent with falls on ice, and hurried movement in the dark. One hiker had a skull injury that raised some questions, but examiners ultimately classified it as non-fatal in itself, an aggravating factor rather than a primary cause. On the surface, these initial findings seemed to point toward a grim but almost ordinary conclusion. A group caught in extreme conditions, leaving the tent in haste, succumbing to cold before they could recover. But the tent itself complicated things. Investigators noted that it had been cut from the inside, slits opened in the fabric as if the occupants had chosen to exit not through the flap but straight through the walls. The tent stood partially collapsed, its supports bent and shifted. Inside lay clothing, boots, food, equipment, personal items that no experienced winter traveller would willingly abandon. To the investigators, this suggested panic, or at least some urgent need that overrode normal procedure. They recorded this, but they could not say why it had happened. Outside, prints in the snow were documented and measured, mostly barefoot or in socks, some in light footwear, all leading away from the tent toward the tree line. No tracks from unknown individuals, no clear sign of a struggle. Wind and later snow had softened the impressions, but searchers at the time insisted they could see a pattern of walking, not running, at least near the tent. This detail went into testimony and into the files, though later retellings would sometimes forget the qualifications and speak of a headlong flight. As March turned to April and then May, the investigation existed in 2 worlds at once. In the pass, search and recovery continued under harsh, shifting conditions. Temperatures still dropped well below freezing. Snow hid almost everything. Aircraft could overfly the area, but low visibility and patchy cover made aerial interpretation unreliable. Ground teams moved slowly, probing, listening for the dull change in sound that meant something solid under the snow. In the city, the case file grew thicker. Prosecutors compiled statements, cross-checked dates, reconstructed the group's last known movements. They looked into the hikers' backgrounds, searching for signs of political unreliability, secret conflicts, anything that might hint at interpersonal violence. They found nothing especially alarming. Ordinary youthful lives, minor disputes, ambitions focused on sport and study. The discovery of the ravine bodies in May forced a new phase. Fresh autopsies were conducted, now with more dramatic findings. Blunt force trauma to chests and skulls, internal injuries described as severe and incompatible with life. At this point, the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, had to contend with a problem that any legal official in his place would recognize: evidence that did not fit neatly into the existing narrative, but also did not clearly point to a prosecutable crime. He recorded the injuries. He cited the forensic assessments that compared their severity to those seen in high-speed accidents. At the same time, pathologists emphasized the absence of typical marks of hand-to-hand violence. No defensive wounds that would suggest fighting, no sharp weapon cuts, no gunshot injuries. Skin remained largely intact over the worst fractures. Clothing on the body showed wear but not shredding consistent with some cinematic attack. The question then became not only what had happened, but what, within the framework of Soviet legal and forensic practice in 1959, could be said to have happened. The constraints were not only physical. The investigation took place in an era and a system where information was handled carefully, where anything that might touch on military activity, state security, or perceived social panic was treated with special caution. The northern Urals were not only remote mountains, they were also a region of strategic installations, training grounds, and restricted zones. If the tragedy involved any sensitive factor, an explosion, a test, an encounter with personnel from a closed facility, that could have influenced how openly investigators were encouraged to speculate in their official conclusions. At the same time, there is no clear contemporary document that states such involvement as fact. What we see instead is a more diffuse kind of pressure, a general tendency to close anomalous cases with language that neither admits scandal nor fuels too much open debate. There were also practical limitations. Forensic science in the Soviet Union in the late 1950s was competent, sometimes excellent, but it did not have access to many tools that would become standard decades later. No DNA analysis, limited capacity for subtle toxicology in rural regions, no advanced imaging that could reconstruct trauma patterns in 3 dimensions. Autopsies were handwritten or typed on paper, subject to the interpretations, habits, and even fatigue of the examiners. Photographs were taken of the tent, of the bodies in situ, of injuries in the morgue, but not every step was documented visually. Some images were later lost, misfiled, or degraded. Measurements of snow depth, exact distances between key points, and detailed topographic profiles of the ravine were often approximate, taken under field conditions by cold, exhausted people who were primarily focused on finding the missing, not on designing an experiment. When we read the case file today, we are looking at a patchwork. Some parts precise and careful, others brief and episodic. Certain scenes that loom large in later imagination, such as the moment the tent was first opened or the exact positioning of bodies in the ravine, exist only in a handful of statements and a few black and white photographs. Around these fixed points, assumptions began to accumulate almost immediately. Investigators made some of those assumptions themselves. They described likely movements from tent to tree line to cedar, cedar to ravine. They inferred that the group split into subgroups with different immediate goals, some tending the fire, some attempting to return to the tent, some seeking better shelter downslope. But these patterns, while plausible, are not all directly observed. They are reconstructions that filled in gaps between the known positions of bodies and the traces left in the snow. The same is true of certain cause-effect chains. When a burned branch is found, it is natural to imagine the fire that produced it. When cut spruce boughs appear near the ravine, the inference is of deliberate den building. These are reasonable, but they are still inferences. The original protocols sometimes blur the line between what was physically seen and what was understood as the only sensible explanation at the time. Eventually, the investigation reached its formal end. On May 28, 1959, the prosecutor issued a resolution closing the criminal case. The final wording would become one of the central puzzles of the Dyatlov story. Translations vary, but the core phrase is usually rendered something like, "The deaths of the hikers were the result of a compelling natural force." It is a curious sentence. The Russian wording evokes something powerful, irresistible, not human. A force of nature, but unspecified. Not avalanche or blizzard or falling rocks, but a more abstract category. It acknowledges that something beyond the hikers' control overwhelmed them. It declines to say exactly what that something was. Modern readers often project a great deal onto that line. Some see it as a deliberate obfuscation, a way to close the file without admitting to a military accident or other sensitive cause. Others see it as an honest expression of uncertainty within the conceptual tools available at the time. The investigators could see no evidence of murder, no sign of external attack, no clear technological cause. But they had no single tidy natural explanation that covered every injury, every action, every oddity. So they chose a phrase that marked the limits of their understanding and the boundaries of what they were willing or able to state. Inside the files, other ambiguities persist. Radiation tests were conducted on some items of clothing, yielding elevated readings on a few pieces. The reports mention this, but do not pursue it in depth. There is no comprehensive mapping of radiation across all items, no attempt to reconstruct contamination pathways. Later, enthusiasts would seize on these partial data points, spinning elaborate narratives around them. In the original context, they appear as one more anomaly noted but not integrated into a central theory. Over the decades that followed, the Dyatlov case slipped into a kind of archival twilight. Officially, it was closed. Unofficially, it was never entirely forgotten. Copies of the case file circulated among a small circle of interested parties, retired rescuers, journalists, amateur investigators. Some documents went missing. Others were retyped, recopied, sometimes with small errors or omissions. Memories of participants evolved with time, with retellings, with the quiet pressure of knowing that their story now fed something much larger than a regional tragedy. In the late Soviet period, and especially after the collapse of the USSR, wider access to archival material breathed new life into the discussion. Photographs that had rarely been seen were published. Autopsy reports once confined to dusty folders were scanned and translated. Western researchers added their own interpretations, sometimes limited by imperfect translations, sometimes bringing fresh technical expertise in fields like avalanche science or forensic pathology. This second life of the investigation changed the shape of the mystery. Points that had once been minor footnotes, phrasing in a particular autopsy, a sketch of the tent's interior, a passing mention of weather conditions, became focal in new debates. What had been assumptions hardened into perceived facts in some retellings, while other better documented details were quietly dropped because they did not fit favoured theories. Yet beneath all the layers of interpretation, the skeleton of the original inquiry remains visible. We can see the investigators working under harsh physical conditions, with limited tools, within an institutional environment that prized closure and stability. We can see them trying to reconcile contradictory clues, to honour both the expertise of the forensic doctors and the constraints of the legal framework, and we can see, in their final, carefully chosen words, an acknowledgement that something happened on that mountainside that they could not fully map onto any familiar category. It is in the space between what they wrote down and what they left unsaid that much of the legend now lives. From there, later generations would begin to construct their own explanations, natural, human, and sometimes stranger, trying again and again to answer the question that the 1959 investigation, for all its effort, could only circle around. What exactly was that compelling force in the night? To explore those possibilities, we have to step away for a moment from the language of prosecutors and into the colder, slower language of mountains and weather. When people first hear the Dyatlov story, their minds often jump straight to the strange. But if you sit with the case file, with the maps and weather charts and the dry prose of mountaineering manuals, the first thing that emerges is not the uncanny, it is how ruthless and how subtle winter mountains can be. The most straightforward family of explanations is also the one that feels, at first glance, the easiest to dismiss: avalanches. The official inquiry in 1959 did not find clear classic avalanche evidence. No huge debris fan, no snapped tree trunks, no deep deposition burying the tent site when rescuers arrived. The slope above the tent is relatively gentle, somewhere around 20 to 30 degrees depending on exactly where you measure, right on the edge of what most people think of when they imagine avalanche terrain. Yet modern avalanche science has added nuance to that picture. Not all avalanches are roaring white rivers that sweep forests away. Some are quieter, subtler processes with names that didn't exist in the Soviet record. Slab avalanches, glide cracks, snow loading, delayed release. In 2019, a group of researchers, drawing on both historical data and computerized models, proposed that a small but dense slab of wind-deposited snow could have formed above the tent. The hikers, digging a platform into the slope to set up camp, might have undercut this slab just enough to destabilize it. Wind during the night, adding fresh loading from above, could have been the final nudge. In this scenario, not a massive avalanche, but a localized block of hard-packed snowslides, striking the tent with enough force to crush ribs, crack skulls, and bend tent supports. Not enough to erase every trace on the slope, but enough to convince experienced people that they had to get out of there immediately, in the dark before more came down. This has some strengths. It helps explain why the tent was cut from the inside. Fabric pressing down, poles leaning, snow pushing inward could make the normal exit difficult or feel too slow. Slashes near arm's reach become the fastest way out. It offers a mechanism for heavy internal injuries without the external lacerations you would expect from a beating or a fall onto rocks. The snow acts like a blunt distributed hammer. It can also help explain why the group moved away from the tent downslope, toward the tree line, instead of straight along the ridge. But the slab model has weaknesses too. Rescue teams who reached the site did not report significant snow accumulation over the tent. Some later argued that wind in the weeks between the incident and discovery could have scoured away evidence, but that's a reconstruction, not an observation. The slope angle, while potentially adequate for small slabs under the right conditions, is still marginal in many avalanche textbooks. Other natural mechanisms try to stay closer to the original forensic picture, while still involving snow as an active agent. One idea focuses on snow loading over time, not in a single dramatic release. Heavy winds in the northern Urals can build deep cornices and drifts. If the tent was set in a shallow excavation, with a cut bank of snow directly upslope, that bank could have slowly failed, settling or sliding partway into the shelter during the night. The effect on the occupants would be similar from the inside: sudden weight, constriction, a sense that the ceiling is collapsing, that you are being buried. Even without catastrophic velocity, the stress of hundreds of kilograms of compact snow pressing onto multiple bodies could cause panic, and in unlucky positions, serious trauma. The problem again is evidence. The snow profile at the tent site was not documented in a way that lets us reconstruct exact loading patterns. Drawings are sparse, terms are vague. We know there was some snow over the tent. We do not know precisely how much, or how it was distributed. Some proposals add another layer, wind and something stranger sounding, but rooted in physics, infrasound. Under certain conditions, strong, steady winds passing over particular topographies can generate low-frequency sound waves, below the threshold of human hearing but still perceptible as vibration and pressure changes. Some researchers have suggested that the shape of the pass, combined with a storm that night, might have produced powerful infrasound effects. Experiments in other contexts suggest that such waves can induce feelings of dread, disorientation, even panic in some people. Applied to Dyatlov, the idea is that the hikers, overwhelmed by an inexplicable sense of menace, fled a tent that was physically intact, cutting their way out in confusion. As a hypothesis, it is intriguing. It provides a way to imagine intense fear without an obvious external threat. It fits with the fact that footprints near the tent suggest walking, not a chaotic stampede, perhaps a hurried but still semi-organized withdrawal from something that felt wrong but was not visually obvious. Yet this line of thinking rests on several untested assumptions: that the specific shape of the pass and the known wind conditions that night could indeed generate such infrasound, that the effect would be overwhelming enough to drive 9 hardened winter travellers into the cold without full gear, that their responses would be so uniform. There is, as of now, no direct measurement linking that terrain on that night to that kind of acoustic event. It remains an elegant story built on plausible physics but incomplete data. Less exotic and perhaps more sobering are explanations that focus not on some hidden force, but on human decision-making under pressure in a very ordinary, very unforgiving environment. Consider navigation and tent placement. As they climbed onto the eastern shoulder of Collet Shackle, the group appears to have intended to cross the ridge and camp in the relative shelter of forested slopes beyond. Instead, they stopped on the open incline, exposed to wind. Why? The most common reconstruction is simple: weather closed in, reducing visibility. In blowing snow, even skilled navigators can drift off course. especially late in the day when fatigue sets in. Realizing the mistake, Dyatlov may have chosen to camp where they were rather than lose altitude they'd have to regain in the morning. From a sports tourism perspective of the time, it had a kind of harsh logic. Practice hardship, test the group, gain experience camping in exposed conditions. The slope, while not ideal, may not have looked particularly dangerous by daylight, but mountain weather turns fast. A moderate breeze in late afternoon can become a punishing gale at night. Temperatures can plunge. Blowing snow can erase tracks in minutes and load slopes unevenly. A camp that feels marginally uncomfortable at dusk can become desperate by 2 a.m. Put these together and you get a chain. Slightly off-course camp on an exposed marginal slope, worsening weather, possible snow build-up and tent deformation, an internal sense, whether from physical impact, threatening sounds, or simply fear, that staying put means being buried. So they leave. In this framework, many odd details start to look less like mysteries and more like the familiar fingerprints of hypothermia. Hypothermia does not arrive all at once. As core temperature drops, thinking becomes slow, judgment impaired. People make choices that, from a warm armchair decades later, seem irrational. Paradoxical undressing is one of the strangest seeming of these behaviours. In some severe hypothermia cases, victims remove clothing despite lethal cold. One explanation is that peripheral blood vessels, which had constricted, suddenly dilate as thermal regulation breaks down, creating a sensation of intense internal heat. The brain misinterprets signals. People feel overheated when they are in fact dying of cold. At Dyatlov, several bodies were found partially undressed, some barefoot, some stripped to undergarments. At first, this seems incompatible with trained winter hikers. But when you account for hypothermia's cognitive effects, it becomes less surprising. Clothing redistribution adds another layer. We know from forensic notes that some of the better garments, wool sweaters, warmer leggings, parts of jackets, were found on the later discovered bodies in the ravine. Some of these items originally belonged to hikers who had died nearer the cedar. One way to read this is grimly practical. As individuals succumb to cold, the still living removed usable clothing to try to keep themselves or others warm. This pattern is documented in other cold weather disasters. It can create the appearance of paradoxical undressing. Even when most clothing removal was rational and deliberate, there are weaknesses here too. Hypothermia explains poor decision-making over time, not the initial decision to leave the tent underdressed. The earliest moments of the incident likely involved people who were still relatively warm and competent. For them to step out into known extreme cold with so little gear implies a factor they perceived as immediately life-threatening inside or around the tent. Natural explanations, in the end, do not converge neatly on a single, flawless narrative. Avalanche variants can model crushing injuries but must stretch to account for the lack of classic surface signs. Wind and infrasound can model fear but rely on unmeasured conditions. Navigation error and bad tent placement can model exposure but need a trigger to explain the abrupt exit. Hypothermia can model irrational later behaviour, but not necessarily the first, decisive choice. Yet, taken together, these threads form something like a tapestry seen in low light. You may not see every stitch, but a pattern emerges. A group in a precarious camp, in worsening weather, on a marginal slope confronted by some combination of snow movement, wind, noise, and perceived danger, a hurried escape, an attempt to regroup and survive at the tree line, a long losing battle against cold and darkness. There is nothing in this picture that requires the supernatural. What it does require is an appreciation of how quickly a situation can turn, how many small natural factors can align into something that feels, from the inside, like a single overwhelming, compelling force. Still, mountains are not only shaped by wind and snow, they are also shaped by the people who walk them, their fears, their errors, their loyalties. To understand why this particular night has echoed so loudly for so long, we have to look not just at what the environment might have done to the hikers, but at what the hikers themselves brought into that storm. From natural forces on the slope we turn now to human factors and to the stories that grew in the long shadow of what happened there. When people grow up in a world saturated with secrecy, they tend to reach for hidden hands when something terrible happens. The northern Urals in 1959 were not just empty mountains. They sat inside a vast security state, laced with restricted zones, weapons testing grounds, labour camps, and places you did not go unless you were told to go. The Dyatlov group were not naive villagers stumbling into that landscape. They were technically educated, politically vetted, living in a society where you learned early that some things were said and some things were not. So as soon as it became clear that 9 bright, loyal young people had died in baffling circumstances on a slope that nobody had even bothered to name, another family of explanations emerged. Not avalanche, not hypothermia, but people, orders, secrets. Some versions are simple. Perhaps the story goes the hikers strayed too close to something they should not have seen. A weapons test, a secret facility, a patrol. They were confronted, driven into the cold, maybe attacked. Later, an embarrassed or frightened authority apparatus tried to clean up the mess, leaving behind an awkward mixture of honest rescue work and clumsy concealment. Others are more elaborate. Military parachute mines detonating in the air above the pass, filling the night with shock waves and blinding flashes, frightening the group out of the tent. Special forces stumbling on them, misreading them as intruders. KGB agents infiltrating the expedition for reasons that shift with each retelling. To understand why these ideas took hold, you have to place yourself not on the snow, but in the late 1950s Soviet Union. This was deep in the Cold War. Only a few years earlier, Stalin had died. The Gulag system, though changing, still cast a long shadow. New weapons were being developed in remote regions. Nuclear tests, rocket launches, radar experiments. None of these were things citizens were told much about. Accidents happened, and when they did, the instinct of the system was to close ranks, classify, deny. People knew that. They might not know specific details, but they knew the pattern. Then, into that environment, drop a case where the route to the pass skirts areas known later to have hosted military activity. Some witnesses, far from the site, report seeing unusual lights in the sky around the relevant dates. The official investigation concludes with a vaguely phrased line about a compelling force and closes relatively quickly. Files are not widely available, some are marked secret. It does not take an imaginative leap to connect these dots into the outline of a cover-up. But if you move slowly through the evidence, the picture becomes more complicated. The military was involved in the search, but that was normal. In a country with limited civilian aviation infrastructure, it was standard practice for soldiers and pilots to be called in for large-scale rescue operations. Helicopters, specialist units, even prosecutors were dispatched to remote accidents as a matter of course. The site itself showed no clear traces of battlefield action. No bullet wounds were recorded in the autopsies, no shell craters, no blast scarring on trees, no shrapnel documented in bodies or clothing. Broken ribs and fractured skulls were there, but pattern and description fit crushing far better than explosions at close range. The parachute mine theory tries to address this by moving the source of force away from the ground. Airburst munitions can create powerful pressure waves without leaving obvious surface craters, especially in snow. Fragmentation can be limited. It becomes possible, at least in outline, to imagine concussive injuries without classic shrapnel patterns. The appearance of scorched or tanned skin on some bodies, noted by investigators, is then folded in as possible thermal effect. Yet, again, detail complicates the narrative. The pattern of injuries is not uniform as you might expect from group exposure to a large blast. Some of the hikers have severe internal trauma, others die with comparatively minor physical damage. Most of the clothing examined does not show the kind of singeing, tearing, or embedded particles associated with proximity to explosive events. The burns often cited are localized and could have other explanations. Contact with coals from the cedar fire, prolonged exposure to cold and sun, decomposition artifacts in the morgue. Claims of unusual radioactive contamination on certain garments are often held up as a smoking gun. One laboratory analysis did record slightly elevated readings on a few pieces of clothing, but those garments appear to have come from hikers who worked in facilities where low-level radioactive materials were present. Their friends said their previous jobs involved contact with such substances. Background contamination from everyday Soviet industry is not a dramatic explanation, but it is a plausible one. The levels measured were above natural background, but not orders of magnitude higher. Not the kind of blistering exposure you'd associate with an unknown nuclear disaster on the pass itself, and subsequent re-examinations and independent measurements on preserved items have sometimes failed to replicate the sensational readings of early reports. Then there are these strange lights. Several residents in the broader region reported glowing objects, fireballs, or flashes in the sky around the time of the tragedy. In a Cold War context that immediately suggests rockets, flares, or weapons tests. Soviet records do show that missile and high-altitude tests were periodically conducted across large swathes of the country, sometimes over the Urals. Some researchers have tried to match known launches to the relevant nights. Others point to meteors, which are common and can be spectacular in winter skies. The problem is temporal and spatial resolution. Many of the most cited sighting reports are vague about exact date and direction. Some clearly occurred days before or after the likely night of the incident. The distance from those observer locations to the Dyatlov camp is often hundreds of kilometers. Could the hikers have seen something similar? Possibly. Did something in the sky, natural or human-made, terrify them into flight? There is no direct evidence for that. Their last photographs show normal winter scenes, cheerful faces, routine camp life. No blurred streaks across the stars, no captions in the recovered diaries hinting at awe or alarm. And yet, because the case is unresolved, every scrap of ambiguity becomes fertile ground. Files were not entirely open. Some documents did go missing over the ensuing decades. Officials did disagree quietly about what weight to give various factors. In the 1990s and 2000s, when former Soviet archives began to partially open, researchers found inconsistencies, dates misprinted, pages out of order, annotations that raised more questions than they answered. In a society long trained to read between the lines, this looked like classic smoke, and where there is smoke, people assume there must be fire. Here you begin to see how mysteries accumulate extra details over time. An offhand remark in a memoir about restricted areas near the route becomes, the group camped right next to a secret base, in a later retelling. A lab note about contamination above control on 2 garments transforms into, they were all covered in radioactive dust. A vague phrase in a prosecutor's summary, never meant as metaphysical, a compelling force, is lifted out of its bureaucratic context and used as proof that the investigators themselves believed in something unearthly. Each generation retells the story, smoothing some edges, sharpening others. Television documentaries privilege the most cinematic elements. Popular books emphasize conflict and intrigue. Internet discussions add speculative numbers where the original documents were silent. Over decades you end up with 2 separate entities, the historical case file, fragmentary and flawed, and the legend, dense and strangely complete. Evaluating claims in that kind of environment requires a particular kind of patience. You ask simple questions. Where did this detail first appear? In a contemporary document, a sworn testimony, a lab sheet, or in a memoir written 30 years later, or an article quoting unnamed sources? Can the claim be cross-checked from independent directions? If there was a weapons test, are there declassified military logs, foreign radar records, or consistent witness reports from multiple settlements? If there was widespread radiation, do preserved artifacts and soil samples today show it? When details disagree, you resist the urge to choose the most exciting one. You accept that we don't know is sometimes the only honest answer. Applied to Dyatlov, this kind of cautious reading doesn't erase human-related possibilities. It simply shrinks them back down from grand conspiracies to something more modest and, in a way, more unsettling. It is entirely possible that local officials, terrified of being blamed, shaped the investigation to protect themselves, nudging conclusions away from administrative negligence and toward a convenient if vague force of nature. It is possible that small-scale military activity, flares, experimental munitions, aircraft, took place somewhere in the greater region that winter, and that some of the lights people reported were indeed secret tests. That does not automatically mean the hikers were directly harmed by them. It is possible that classified procedures, not sinister intent, explain why certain documents were stamped, stored, or redacted in ways that now look suspicious. In a security bureaucracy, almost everything is secret by default. What remains, after you strip away the layers of rumour, are still gaps. We do not know exactly what sound, sight, or sensation made 9 people leave their tent so quickly, so incompletely dressed. We do not know the precise sequence of their decisions at the cedar and in the ravine, who proposed what, who went where, who tried to go back. We do not know whether any human presence, armed or otherwise, came within sight of them that night. Certainty is difficult because the evidence is thin, the environment erased many traces, and the institutional context blurred others. The passage of time has not filled in those blanks. It has only given us more stories to lay across them. So the Dyatlov Pass sits at a crossroads where natural hazard, human error, institutional secrecy, and cultural imagination meet. Each traveller brings their own weight to the scales. Some favour snow and wind, some favour soldiers and secrets, some favour lights in the sky. In the end, the mountain does not explain itself. We are left with probabilities, not proofs, with scenarios that feel more or less plausible, depending on how you read a line in a report, or a contour on a map, or a sentence in a diary written by a young man who never thought it would be his last. From here, in the quiet hours, we can try to weigh those possibilities without rushing to a verdict. We can hold in mind both the cold mechanics of physics and the warm, messy reality of human fear and rumour. And then gently we can ask, given all of that, what can we say? And what must we admit still slips away into the snow? We can start by gathering the pieces that are least in dispute and set them down in order like stones along a winter trail. 9 experienced hikers, properly equipped for a long February route, pitched their tent on the eastern slope of Kolat late on the afternoon of February 1, 1959. They dug into the snow, anchored the tent, cooked a simple meal, wrote in their diaries. Nothing in those last entries suggests panic, conflict, or dread. Just tired satisfaction and small jokes about the wind. Sometime that night, probably between late evening and early morning, something changed. The tent was cut from the inside. Footprints led down slope, not in a wild scattering, but in a line of walking or fast-walking steps, many of them barefoot or in socks. The group moved toward the tree line, toward shelter, firewood, and thicker air. At the cedar, a fire was lit. 2 of the hikers died there, lightly clothed, with signs that they had tried to climb into the branches, perhaps searching for a better view, perhaps driven by cold or confusion. 3 more bodies were found in between the tree and the tent, spaced along a line that roughly connects them, heading up slope. Their postures and positions suggest people trying and failing to return. Much later, when the snow softened and rescuers dug deeper into the ravine, 4 more were discovered. They had more clothing, some of it taken from the bodies at the cedar, and more severe internal injuries, crushed ribs, damaged lungs, a fractured skull. No long clean knife wounds, no bullet tracks, no torn metal fragments embedded in bone. This is the skeleton of the story that most researchers, even those who argue fiercely about details, will accept. The group left the tent suddenly. They moved together toward the trees. Some died quickly, some later, some with signs of violent mechanical trauma that did not puncture the skin. They did not come back. The real arguments live in the spaces between those points. Why did they leave the tent at all and so poorly dressed? How did the ravine injuries happen? Why did the official language remain so vague? And why were some documents handled so clumsily that later generations suspected design rather than error? If you look at the leading explanations, they tend to circle back to a few broad families: natural snow and weather events, physiological or psychological disturbances, human interventions and combinations of those. The classic avalanche scenario, in its modern variant, does not require a roaring cinematic wave of snow tearing down the whole slope. It imagines a small localized slab failure loading onto the tent. To make that version persuasive, you would want clear geomorphological evidence, a slope angle and profile that match known slab avalanche conditions, snowpack data from that week. Convincing modelling that shows how a shallow but dense block of snow could collapse a tent, bruise or fracture ribs, and yet leave the camp area looking relatively undisturbed by the time rescuers arrived weeks later. You would also want the pattern of injuries to line up with people being pressed or partially buried, then later moving under their own power. Some of the bruising and fractures can be described that way. Others are harder to reconcile with a single, brief event. The katabatic wind or panic in the storm scenarios rely less on heavy snow and more on sensory overload. They imagine brutal, sudden gusts, strange sounds resonating through the tent fabric, the feeling of the slope shifting, or the fear that more movement was imminent. In that frame, the cuts in the tent become an emergency exit, not proof of outside attackers. To make that convincing, you would want detailed meteorological reconstructions, wind speeds, temperature profiles, evidence of similar events in comparable terrain where people have fled structures irrationally under pressure from the elements. You would want to know how a group used to rough conditions could still be driven into a chain of decisions that, from a distance, look catastrophically unwise. The infrasound hypothesis goes deeper into the nervous system. It suggests that under certain wind conditions, low-frequency vibrations on the slope might trigger unease, nausea, or panic in some people, like a resonance set up in the human body and brain. For that to carry weight, you'd need experimental data, measurements of infrasound in similar mountain topographies, controlled studies showing that such exposure can produce coherent shared panic responses, not just vague discomfort. Human-related explanations from accidental confrontation to deliberate violence would need their own supporting traces. If there had been a struggle around the tent, you might expect chaotic footprints, drag marks, bloodstains frozen into the snow under the canvas. If weapons had been used, you might expect characteristic injuries, metallic residues, cartridge cases dropped in haste. If an external group had forced the hikers down to the trees and then disappeared, you would want at least one solid contemporary testimony from someone involved in the search, mentioning unfamiliar prints, discarded equipment, or signs of vehicle tracks cut off by later snow. Many of these details are simply not in the record, either because they never existed, or because the investigators did not think to write them down, or because the documents where they lived were lost in the slow entropy of archives. Then there are composite models, a small slab slide compromising the tent and injuring one or two people, a nighttime scramble to get the group to the trees, an attempt to survive by the fire, a desperate return for supplies, an accidental fall into the ravine while moving along the creek bed in the dark. These frameworks do not require any single spectacular event. They spread cause across the night in a sequence of misjudgments and bad luck. To feel confident in such a chain, you would need fine-grained timing, more precise estimates of how long each person might have survived in those temperatures and that clothing, more detailed mapping of the microtopography between the cedar and the ravine, more forensic reconstruction of how specific fractures could come from a fall into a snow-filled gully. Instead, for almost every proposed solution, we have a similar pattern, enough evidence to sketch a plausible scene, not quite enough to ink it in. So we end up with probabilities rather than verdicts. It is reasonable, based on clothing, body positions, and the lack of clear combat injuries, to think that nature, not deliberate human attack, was the primary killer that night. It is reasonable to think that some physical stressor, a snow load, a strange sound, a perceived danger, made the tent feel unsafe from the inside, at least long enough for the group to prioritize immediate flight over careful dressing. It is reasonable to see the ravine injuries as the result of concentrated pressure or impact, possibly from a fall into a confined snow-choked channel, rather than from explosive force or handheld weapons. Beyond that, the curve of certainty drops off quickly. Part of why the Dyatlov story endures is that those gaps sit right at the intersection of human capability and environmental indifference. These were not amateurs. They had trained, planned, calculated risk. They had survived previous routes, winter storms, mishaps. They understood frostbite and whiteouts, and the way snow can hide its own dangers. And still, a set of conditions, perhaps not even particularly rare in that region, combined in a way that outpaced their skill. The mountain did not have to be malicious. It only had to be itself. When we read their last diary entries now, the little complaints about damp socks and bad weather, we know how close they are to the edge without realizing it. That knowledge pulls at us. It suggests how thin the line sometimes is between hard but manageable and lethal, even for people who know what they are doing. In that sense, the Dyatlov Pass is not only a riddle, it is a reminder that training and caution improve our odds, but do not guarantee our safety. That institutions, even when they mean well, can muddy the record enough that later generations inherit not answers, but puzzles. That stories grow over the bones of events, filling empty spaces with fears and hopes that say as much about us as about the past. We can, with care, strip some of that away. We can say there was a tent and a storm and a night when a group of capable young people lost control of their situation. We can say they tried to stay together for as long as they could. We can say the snow and the cold finished what something, somewhere between canvas and tree line, had begun. What we cannot say, not honestly, is what exact thought ran through Igor Dyatlov's mind when he agreed to cut the tent, or through the last survivor's mind as the fire died and the wind rose. We cannot say whether, in those final minutes, anyone believed help might still be coming. Some part of the story will always walk a little ahead of us in the dark, just out of reach, and perhaps that is why, decades later, people still trace the route on maps, read and reread the files, sit awake at night listening to the wind in their own cities and wondering, not only what happened, but something smaller, more personal. If I had been there, on that slope with that group in that wind, would I have chosen differently? Or would the same snow, the same cold, the same nameless pressure have carried me down into the trees as well? From here, far away in time and space, we can't follow them any further. We can only stand at the edge of what we know, look out over the white, and let the unanswered pieces drift gently back into the dark. And as we do, we join the quiet company of all the others who have paused by this mystery, shared their thoughts, argued their theories, and then, eventually, turned away and gone back to their own lives. In a moment we'll leave the past behind for tonight, but not the people who walked there, or the strange community that has grown around their story. The Dyatlov hikers step out of our reach at the tree line, but their absence keeps echoing. Stories like this linger because they sit right where our minds like to wander when the lights are low and the world is quiet. At that hour, we're not just interested in clean solutions and closed cases, we're interested in the edge of the map, in the point where evidence thins out, and we're left with careful guesses in the shape of our own questions. This particular mountain, this particular night, offers just enough solid detail to feel real, and just enough missing information to feel haunted. We know there was wind, and snow, and cold beyond anything most of us will ever meet. We know there were 9 young people who had worked hard to earn the right to be there. We know they joked over dinner, zipped the tent, and then, at some point, crossed a line from control into crisis. Beyond that, the picture softens. Was it a loaded slab of snow pressing at the canvas? A strange sound in the storm convincing them that the next minutes mattered more than shoes and coats? A fall into a concealed gully that turned a desperate plan into tragedy? Each possibility is anchored in something we recognize from other mountains, other winters. None of them quite seals the case, and so the past remains what it has been for decades now, a place where people bring their own tools of understanding. Engineers run models, doctors re-examine injuries, local guides talk about the way wind moves on that slope, archivists go hunting through yellowed papers for one more overlooked line. In the end, they all stand where we're standing now, at the edge of what the record can bear, looking out into the same white silence. There is a kind of comfort in that too, not in the loss itself, but in the shared act of looking, the idea that somewhere, right now, someone else is listening to this same story, in another room, another country, tracing the same footpaths in their mind and feeling that same small pull of curiosity. If you're still awake, and you'd like to be part of that quiet circle, You can let me know where you're listening from. A city, a village, a ship at sea, a night shift desk. Just a line in the comments saying, "I'm here, and this is where the wind sounds different to me." You can also, if you'd like, leave your thoughts about the pass itself. Which explanations feel most plausible to you? Which details you find hardest to let go of? Over time, those comments become a kind of modern campfire. Different voices, different angles, all thrown together around the same old mystery. If this slow walk through snow and history helped you drift towards sleep, or gave your thoughts a gentler place to wander for a while, you can tap like, or subscribe, or ring whatever little digital bell your platform uses. It helps other people find their way here. People who might also be lying awake looking for a story that doesn't demand anything from them except attention, and even that only for as long as their eyes stay open. If you're the sort of person who likes to sink deeper into the past, beyond the Soviet archives and Cold War paperwork, into older layers of human time, there's more waiting for you as well. Earlier in this channel, we spent time with a different kind of mystery. The era when our own species almost didn't make it. When the entire human future balanced on the survival of a few thousand people, scattered across harsh landscapes, carrying fire and stories and the first fragile versions of the languages we speak now. That journey, through prehistoric bottlenecks and branching species, and the long, slow return from the edge of extinction, has become a book about prehistoric secrets, and the ways they still live in our bones. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if it sounds like the right companion for your bedside table at sleepytimehistory.com. No rush, no pressure, just another lantern if you want one, burning a little way down the same long road. For tonight, though, we can let the mountains go. The storm over Kholat has long since blown itself out. The searchers have gone home. The files have been boxed and unboxed and scanned. The snow on that slope has melted and fallen and drifted again in countless new patterns since 1959. The hikers themselves are beyond cold now, beyond questions, beyond the tug of war between theories. Whatever fear they felt is over. Whatever courage they showed has already been spent. What remains for us is a quiet kind of respect, and the decision to remember that they were not only subjects in a strange file, but people who sang on the trail and teased one another about sore feet. As you lie wherever you are, under city lights or country stars or a ceiling you've seen too many times, you can let their story fold shut like a diary at the end of a long day. The tent is dark again. The wind is only wind. You're here, far from that slope, wrapped in your own warmth, with the simple luxury of being able to close your eyes without needing to listen for the next gust or the next crack in the snow. If your thoughts stray back to the past as you drift off, let them do it gently, not as a sharp, unsolved puzzle, but as one more reminder of how thin and precious the line of safety can be, and how many people, known and unknown, have walked it before you. Thank you for keeping watch with me this far into the night. Wherever you're listening from, I hope the rest of your hours are soft and that sleep comes quietly, like fresh snow over old tracks. Good night, and until next time, keep the lantern